Hey friends! Glad you're here at Super Harry. We've cooked up something special. What if Hogwarts ceiling showed 1,400 love potions from Ginny's trunk to everyone in Great Hall? Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1. The sky breaks open. The morning smelled like bacon and something was wrong. Harry couldn't have said what, exactly. It was the kind of wrongness that lived below thought, below language, the way a room feels different when someone has been through your things, even if everything is exactly where you left it. He'd felt it the moment he pushed open the doors to the Great Hall, the warmth of enchanted candles hitting his face, the low roar of 600 students eating and talking and existing all at once. He'd felt it and dismissed it, the way he dismissed most things these days that didn't have a name. He sat down at the Gryffindor table between Ron and Neville, reached for the pumpkin juice, and tried to remember what day it was. Tuesday. Double potions after lunch. He should probably have done the reading. You look terrible, Ron said helpfully, loading his plate with enough sausages to feed a small family. Thanks. Did you sleep? Some. Ron absorbed this with the equanimity of someone who had been sharing a dormitory with Harry Potter for 5 years and understood that some was as good as it was going to get. He passed the bacon without being asked. That was the thing about Ron, there were whole conversations he could hold without saying anything, and Harry had always valued that more than he could properly express. Hermione was already seated across from them, her copy of Advanced Potion-Making propped against the marmalade jar, though Harry noticed her eyes kept tracking the length of the table rather than the page. She had that particular expression she wore when she was cataloging something, not reading, not relaxed, but processing, like a machine that couldn't quite switch off. Morning, Harry offered. She glanced up, and something moved across her face that he couldn't quite catch. Morning, she said. Did you finish the Transfiguration essay? Most of it. Harry, I said most of it, Hermione, it's Tuesday morning. She pressed her lips together and looked back at her book, but her eyes had stopped moving across the page entirely. The Great Hall filled around them in the ordinary way of school mornings, noisy and overlapping, Seamus arguing with Dean about Quidditch statistics, Lavender and Parvati in some intense whispered conference at the end of the bench, Professor Flitwick accepting a stack of essays from a third year with the resigned expression of a man who had been collecting essays for 40 years and expected to collect them for 40 more. The ceiling above rippled with the grey-gold suggestion of early morning cloud cover, the enchantment that had always struck Harry as one of the more genuinely wonderful pieces of magic in the castle, not flashy, not powerful in any combat sense, just honest. The sky above, rendered faithfully below. Whatever was happening outside, you could see it in here. He looked up at it, the way he sometimes did when the silence in his own head got too loud. The clouds shifted. Light moved across them. And then the ceiling stuttered. It was such a small thing at first that Harry thought he'd imagined it, a tremor in the enchantment, the way a television screen sometimes skips a frame. The clouds held their shape but seemed, just for a fraction of a second, to have been filmed from a different angle. A few people glanced upward reflexively. Then the chatter resumed, and the bacon sizzled, and someone laughed too loudly 3 seats down. Then it happened again. This time Hermione's head came up fully, her book forgotten, her eyes locked on the ceiling with an expression Harry had learned to take very seriously indeed. It was the expression that preceded statements like "we need to leave now" or "that's not actually safe" or "I've been wrong about something important." Hermione, he said quietly. She didn't answer. Her lips moved slightly, the way they did when she was running through a mental catalogue at speed, and Harry felt the wrongness from earlier sharpen into something with edges. The ceiling shuddered. It was visible this time, a full-body tremor that ran across the entire enchanted expanse from the staff table end to the great oak doors, like a drum's skin being struck from above. The clouds didn't dissolve so much as they were displaced, shoved sideways by something pushing through from behind the enchantment itself. The warm gold light of the candles dimmed by a fraction. Conversations died in patches across all 4 tables, heads tilting back one by one in that crowd behavior way, a Mexican wave of unease spreading through 600 people. What's happening to the ceiling? Neville asked, and his voice came out smaller than usual. Nobody answered him because at that moment the first vial appeared. It dropped out of the enchanted sky the way raindrops appear, not conjured, not thrown, but summoned from somewhere else and delivered here, materializing with the faint pop of displaced air about 30 feet above the Gryffindor table. It was small. Green glass, stoppered with a cork, filled with something viscous and rose gold that caught the candlelight and threw it back in miniature suns. There was a label on it. Harry could see the label even from this distance, could see the handwriting on it, could see, then the second one appeared. And the third. By the 10th, the silence in the great hall was absolute. They poured out of the ceiling in a cascade that built from a trickle to a torrent, vial after vial after vial, materializing in their hundreds and spreading across the width of the enchanted sky with the casual abundance of a rainstorm. They didn't fall, they floated, descending slowly, rotating gently on invisible axes, catching the light from every angle, and the combined glow of all that rose-gold liquid gave the great hall a sunset warmth it had never worn before. It was, in the way of many terrible things, genuinely beautiful. Harry counted without meaning to. His mind did it automatically, the way it had always processed threats, cataloging, measuring, assigning scale. He got to 50 before the counting became impossible. He got to something that felt like hundreds before the number stopped mattering and something much colder settled in its place. There were labels on every single one. He could read the nearest. It was floating at eye level now, rotating slowly 4 feet from his face, and the handwriting on the label was handwriting he recognized. He'd seen it on birthday cards. He'd seen it on notes passed to him in corridors. He'd seen it on the back of photographs she'd tucked into his hand with a smile that had always made him feel warm in a way he'd never quite been able to examine. HP, Tuesday 14th, Standard Concentration. Prequidditch. His hand was on the table. He looked at it and didn't recognize it as his own for a moment. Harry, Hermione said, and her voice had dropped to something very controlled and very careful, the voice she used when she was trying not to communicate how frightened she was. Don't touch any of them. He hadn't moved. He didn't think he could move. Around them, the cascade continued. The vials filled the air of the great hall in their hundreds, a floating cloud of rose-gold glass and careful handwriting, and now the entire school was reading the labels on the ones near them with the horrified compulsion of people watching an accident happen in slow motion. Harry heard someone at the Ravenclaw table say what is that supposed to mean and someone at Hufflepuff say wait, those are, and someone he couldn't identify say, clearly and loudly in the spreading silence, those are love potions. Ron made a sound beside him that Harry had never heard Ron make before. It was a very small sound. Almost nothing. The kind of sound that came before a person understood something they were never going to be able to ununderstand. Harry turned to look at him. Ron was holding a vial. He'd reached out and taken one from the air beside him, apparently without thinking about it, and he was reading the label with the expression of a man whose floor had just become the ceiling. His face had gone a color that wasn't quite red and wasn't quite white but some terrible intermediate that had no name. His eyes moved across the label. Then they moved back to the beginning. Then they went to the ceiling, where hundreds more of the same hung suspended in their glittering obscene constellation, and then they came back to the label in his hand. Ron, Harry said. Ron's hand opened. The vial dropped back into the air and floated gently sideways. Ron, don't. Ron's voice was completely flat. Don't say anything yet. The magical display in the ceiling had not finished. As the last vials settled into their positions, suspended and slowly rotating, filling the air above all 4 tables with that terrible rose-gold light, the enchantment did something new. A section of the ceiling near the staff table end brightened and then resolved into an image, and Harry understood with a lurch that the magic wasn't just showing the vials. It was showing their source. The image was recognizable as Gryffindor Tower, rendered in that floating smoke way of magical projections, the common room visible for a moment before the image moved, pulled upward through a floor that became transparent, into a dormitory that Harry had never been inside. Girls' dormitory, 5th year level. And there, In the corner beneath a window that showed a clear morning sky, was a trunk. An ordinary-looking trunk, except for the faint shimmer around its edges that Harry now recognized as heavy-duty concealment charms, layered one over another with the kind of patience that suggested years of practice. The projection hung above the staff table for exactly 5 seconds, clear and devastating and completely specific, and then it dissolved back into the natural sky it had displaced. The great hall held its silence for one more moment. Then it detonated. 600 people all tried to talk at once, and the noise was less like sound than like a physical thing, a wall of voices and scraping benches and the clatter of things being knocked over in the sudden movement. Harry stayed perfectly still in the middle of it. Hermione reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he looked down at her hand and focused on the realness of it, the warmth of it, the fact that it wasn't floating and it wasn't rose gold and it didn't have a label. Harry. Her voice was steady. Deliberately, carefully steady. Look at me. He looked at her. Hermione's eyes were bright and fierce and there was something in them that looked like grief and something that looked like fury and something that looked, underneath both of those things, like a person who had suspected something for a long time and hated being right. We're going to figure this out, she said. All of it. But right now I need you to breathe. He breathed. The chaos continued around them. Professor McGonagall had risen from the staff table and was trying to restore order with her voice alone, which was not nothing. Her voice could cut through considerable noise when she deployed it properly, but the school was not in a state to be ordered right now. The school was in a state to point and exclaim and demand answers and theorize loudly. Harry could hear fragments of it through the roaring in his own ears. Said it was Weasley, the label said, and, love potions, that's illegal while at school, that's a criminal, and, how many is that, how many are there, and closer, from somewhere down the Gryffindor table, a voice he recognized as Seamus saying with the bluntness that was his defining characteristic, well that explains a bloody lot, doesn't it? Harry turned his head and looked down the table. Ginny was sitting 6 seats away. She had not moved. She was not looking at the ceiling, was not looking at the vials, was not looking at the projection that had already dissolved. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table in front of her and she was looking at Harry, and her expression was, he had always found Ginny's expressions difficult to read, had always attributed this to some quality of emotional depth, some complexity that he hadn't yet learned to interpret properly. He saw it differently now. The stillness in her face was not depth. It was control. It was the expression of someone who had always been 5 moves ahead of everyone else in the room and was currently calculating how many moves they still had available. Their eyes met across 6 feet of Gryffindor table. Harry held her gaze, and something moved through him that wasn't yet anger and wasn't yet grief, something cooler and older than either, something that felt, strangely, like clarity. Like the moment when fog burns off a landscape and you can finally see how far the ground actually is from where you thought you were standing. Ginny looked away first. It was such a small thing. The tiniest fraction of a social exchange, the kind of thing that under normal circumstances would barely register. But Harry watched her look away and understood, in the particular way you understand things that you were half knowing for a long time before you named them, that this was the first honest moment he'd ever witnessed from her. Mr. Potter. McGonagall had reached the Gryffindor table. Her voice was stripped down to its essential architecture, not harsh, not loud, but absolutely immovable. Come with me, please. He stood. His body did it before his mind fully agreed to it, the autopilot of 5 years of responding to authority that he'd never entirely unlearned. He pushed back from the bench and rose, and the movement drew eyes from across the hall, which meant that several hundred students watched Harry Potter stand up and walk away from the floating evidence of what had been done to him, and his face was calm, and his hands were still, and he did not look back at Ginny Weasley. Behind him, he heard Hermione stand up too. McGonagall didn't protest her following. She led them both toward the side door that opened onto the corridor beside the Great Hall, the one that bypassed the main entrance and allowed the staff to move students out of the hall without creating a spectacle of the exit. Harry almost laughed at that. The spectacle had already happened. The spectacle was currently floating above 4 tables, gently rotating, casting its rose-gold light over breakfast. The door closed behind them and the noise dropped by half. McGonagall turned to face them both in the corridor. She was a woman who aged without diminishing, who had been teaching for long enough that she had taught most of the parents of her current students, and the lines of her face were the lines of someone who had made innumerable difficult decisions and bore the weight of each one properly. Right now she looked at Harry with something he rarely saw from adults, not pity, not management, but a genuine reckoning. Like she was letting herself see the truth of the situation rather than the version that was easiest to address. "I'm going to need both of your accounts," she said. "But before that, I want to ask, Harry. Are you all right?" The question was so plainly sincere, so unstrategic, that it nearly undid him. He'd been bracing for instructions, for protocol, for the institutional machinery that Hogwarts deployed whenever something happened that required containing. He hadn't been bracing for someone to just ask. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. McGonagall nodded once, as though this was exactly the right answer. "Then we'll give you time to find out. Hermione, what can you tell me about what we just saw?" Hermione had been composing herself in the 3 minutes it had taken to walk here, and had done a fairly remarkable job of it. She stood now with her arms folded and her expression precise and academic, the face she wore when she was going to be very correct about something painful. "They're love potions," she said. "Amortentia-based, by the color and the viscosity, but the concentration will vary by vial. The labels have specific notations, dates, dosage strength, the initials of the intended recipient." A pause. There were initials on every vial I could see clearly. "Multiple recipients." "Multiple," McGonagall repeated, and her voice had gone very quiet. "At least 6 different sets of initials. Possibly more." Another pause, this one carrying the weight of what she was about to say. "HP appeared most frequently. By a significant margin." The corridor was cold and very still. "And the trunk?" McGonagall said. "The enchantments on it are layered. Someone put a lot of work into those concealment charms, years of work, from the look of the accumulation. It wasn't a casual hiding place." Hermione's jaw tightened. Whoever did this had been planning it for a long time and was very careful about keeping it hidden. McGonagall looked at Harry. He met her eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that she didn't already know. Her expression told him she knew. The trunk was in Ginny Weasley's dormitory. The initials appeared most frequently on the vials nearest the Gryffindor table, where Harry Potter sat every morning. The labeling was dated. The magic was deliberate. These were not complicated inferences. "I'm going to need you both to stay out of this corridor," McGonagall said. "I need to get to the dormitory before anyone else does. I'm going to have to ask you, Harry, to go to my office and wait. Hermione, I'd like you with him." She reached into her robes and produced a slip of parchment and a quill without appearing to search for them, and wrote something swift and sharp. "This will tell the gargoyle to let you in. Don't speak to anyone between here and there. Can you do that?" Harry took the parchment. "Yes. Professor," Hermione said, and her voice had dropped a register, "how long has the sealing been? Is that projection something that was deliberately triggered, or, I don't know yet?" McGonagall's answer was honest in a way that Harry noticed. Most adults in authority didn't admit to not knowing things, it went against some institutional instinct toward reassurance. "But I intend to find out. Go, both of you. I'll be there within the half hour." She swept back toward the great hall with the authority of a small siege engine, and Harry and Hermione stood in the corridor alone. The noise from behind the great oak doors had not diminished. If anything it had grown, had taken on new registers, the excited shrillness of a school that had been handed a scandal of extraordinary magnitude and was running it through every social algorithm it possessed at full speed. Harry thought about what it sounded like in there right now. About Ron, sitting at the Gryffindor table with that terrible intermediate color in his face. About Ginny, 6 seats down, with her hands flat and her expression controlled. About all the labels he'd been able to read before the shock had made reading impossible. Pre-Quidditch. As though it were a schedule. As though it were a training protocol. Harry, Hermione said. I know. We should go. I know. Neither of them moved for a moment. I need to ask you something, Harry said, and I need you to answer it honestly even if you think it's going to hurt me. Hermione looked at him without flinching. All right. How long does Amortentia take to clear from someone's system if it's been administered consistently over a long period? The slight movement of her throat. The smallest possible pause. It depends on the concentration and the duration of exposure, she said, in a voice that was doing a great deal of careful work to remain academic. For someone who's been dosed repeatedly over months, or longer, the clearing process can take days or weeks. The residual effects can be subtle. Things like, she stopped. Things like what, Hermione? Things like, she said carefully, a persistent sense of warmth toward the source of the potion. A difficulty distinguishing manufactured feelings from genuine ones. A tendency to feel comfortable and compliant in situations that might, without the potion's influence, have felt wrong. Harry thought about the feeling of wrongness from this morning that had no name and no specific cause. He thought about how he'd dismissed it. Right, he said. We don't know yet, she started. We know what the labels said. She didn't argue. She pressed her lips together and looked at him steadily, and there was something in her eyes that he recognized as the thing that happens when someone who loves you is forced to watch you understand something terrible. Yeah, she said quietly. We do. They walked through the castle together in silence, which was its own kind of conversation. The corridors between the Great Hall and McGonagall's office were strange and echoey at this hour, classes not yet started, most of the students still in the hall processing the spectacle they'd just witnessed. Harry could feel the castle around him, old stone and deep magic, 5 years of memories embedded in every corridor, and he walked through it feeling, with every step, more like himself and less like whoever he'd been 3 hours ago. That was the strangest part. He'd have expected devastation. He'd have expected the particular paralysis of betrayal. And there was something of that, somewhere below the surface, a deep bruise of it that he could feel waiting for him. But on top of it, moving faster than any of that, was something he could only describe as relief. The kind of relief that made no sense unless you understood that part of him had known something was wrong for a very long time and had never been allowed to know what. Now he knew what. McGonagall's office gargoyle accepted the parchment with the imperious dignity of its kind, and the stairs spiraled open, and Harry and Hermione went up into the tidy, stern space with its ranked filing cabinets and its view of the Quidditch pitch and its rows of first-edition Transfiguration texts arranged by publication date. Harry sat in one of the chairs across from the desk. Hermione sat in the other. The fire in the grate was modest and steady. Tell me everything you know about Amortentia, Harry said. Hermione took a breath. And then, because she had always believed that the truth, all of it, even the worst parts, especially the worst parts, was what people deserved, she told him. Amortentia was the strongest love potion known to exist in the wizarding world. It didn't produce genuine love, everyone knew that, it was standard second-year curriculum, but what it produced was indistinguishable from love to the person experiencing it, which was arguably more dangerous. The feeling it generated was total. Not romantic attraction, specifically, but a complete reorientation of the self toward the source of the potion, a warmth, a certainty, a sense of rightness in proximity to that person that bypassed critical thinking entirely. Regular exposure built tolerance, which meant that over time, higher concentrations were needed to maintain the same effect. This was why the labels had noted concentration levels. Someone who knew what they were doing would have needed to adjust the dosage over months or years to compensate for the accumulating tolerance. The labeling on those vials wasn't amateur, Hermione said. She was trying to keep her voice steady and managing it with visible effort. That's, someone who understood the chemistry. Someone who'd studied it carefully. Harry thought about the girl who had, at 14, hexed 4 boys simultaneously with a single curse, performed magic in her first year that had taken most students until fourth year to manage, who had been described by every professor who taught her as exceptionally gifted. "She's talented," he said. It wasn't an observation he'd meant to make out loud, but it came out neutrally, the way you might note that a storm was large. Accurate and without the weight of what it meant. "Very," Hermione agreed, and there was nothing in her voice that excused it. "How long?" he started, and stopped, because he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer but also wasn't sure he could keep it at arm's length much longer. "The dates on the labels that I could read clearly went back to," Hermione hesitated. "Fourth year." "Harry, I saw dates from fourth year." The fire popped. A log shifted. "Fourth year." The Triwizard Tournament. The year that had been such relentless chaos that he'd barely been keeping his head above water, barely sleeping, operating on a level of stress that had made everything outside of immediate survival feel distant and irrelevant. The year when he'd first really noticed Ginny, when something about her had shifted from Ron's little sister to something he'd struggled to name. He sat with that for a moment. He sat with the specific, precise horror of understanding that what he'd mistaken for natural feeling, for the organic, messy, unnameable process of developing genuine affection for someone, had been engineered. Measured out in vials, scheduled, calibrated to his tolerance, adjusted for concentration. The warm certainty he'd felt around her. The way his reservations had always seemed to dissolve in her presence. The way he'd felt comfortable in situations that his own instincts had flagged as strange. All of it, accounted for. All of it, logged in rose-gold glass with careful labels in familiar handwriting. "I should be more upset than I am," he said, mostly to himself. Hermione looked at him carefully. "That might be the last of it working," she said quietly. "The potion reduces emotional intensity toward negative experiences associated with the source. You might feel the full force of it later, when more of it has cleared. Or," Harry said, "it's possible that when something has been wrong for long enough, finding out it was wrong feels more like relief than like loss." She considered this. "Both," she said finally. "Probably both." They sat in the fire's steady warmth and waited for McGonagall, and Harry looked at the window and the pale morning sky visible through it, the real sky, unenchanted, belonging to no one, and let the relief and the bruise exist at the same time without trying to resolve them into a single thing. Down the corridor, somewhere in the direction of the Great Hall, he could still hear the school. He thought about Ron. He thought about that small, terrible sound Ron had made. "He's going to need to be somewhere that isn't that hall," Harry said. "I know. Even before we figure out any of this. He shouldn't have to sit there with all of them watching him." "I know, Harry. Can you? I'll ask McGonagall to get him when she comes up." Hermione's voice had something in it that he recognized as love, the real, inconvenient, present kind that didn't need labels or calibration. "He's your best friend. He's always going to be your best friend. This doesn't change that." "It changes him," Harry said. "Finding out something like this about your family, it changes you." "Yes," she admitted. "It does." The fire burned. The sky outside was pale and clear and honest. And Harry Potter sat in the chair across from the headmistress's desk and waited, feeling the fog lift by degrees, feeling himself arrive, more completely with every passing minute, back inside his own life. The door opened 22 minutes later, and McGonagall came in, and behind her, white-faced and hollow-eyed and carrying himself with the carefulness of someone who has had the floor taken out from under him, came Ron. Harry stood up. Ron stopped in the doorway and looked at him, and his expression did something complex and painful that resolved, after a moment, into something that was mostly just Ron, messy and honest and not trying to be anything other than what it was. "I'm sorry," Ron said. His voice was raw. I can't yet. But I'm sorry." Harry crossed the room and put his hand on Ron's shoulder, solid and present and clear. "I know," he said. Ron nodded, once, and it cost him something. Harry felt that. He let it matter. McGonagall stood at her desk and looked at the three of them with the expression of a woman who had been teaching for a very long time and had seen a great many things and found, to her private grief, that she could still be surprised. She set a sealed vial on her desk, one of the rose-gold ones, label outward, and folded her hands. "Sit down," she said. "All of you. We have a great deal to discuss." Outside, the sky held steady over Hogwarts, pale and real and indifferent to everything happening beneath it, the way the sky always was and the way Harry was only now learning to be grateful for. Chapter 2, The Weight of What Was Real. McGonagall set a second vial on the desk beside the first. Then a third. She arranged them in a line with the methodical precision of someone building an argument they would rather not have to make, each vial rotating slowly in the firelight, the rose-gold liquid catching and throwing back the warmth in a way that was starting to make Harry's teeth ache. She didn't speak while she arranged them. She didn't look up. When the third was in place, she stood back and studied them the way a healer studies a scan, looking for what she already knows is there. "These were recovered from the trunk before anyone else could access the dormitory," she said. "The rest have been secured. All 1,400 of them." A pause that did a lot of work. "I counted." Ron made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "There are several things I need to tell you," McGonagall continued, "and I'm going to tell them to you directly rather than through the usual channels, because you deserve directness and because the usual channels have, in this particular matter, not served you well." She looked at Harry when she said this last part, and the look carried something that was as close to an apology as McGonagall's face had ever come in his experience. Harry held her gaze. "All right. The trunk's enchantments were layered over a period of approximately 3 years, beginning in the summer before your 4th year." She paused to let that land. "The concealment charms are 7th-year level work. Some of them exceed 7th-year level. They were built incrementally, added to, adjusted. This was not impulsive. This was not a single misguided decision. She planned it from first year," Hermione said, quietly. "Not a question." "The earliest dated vial is from the summer of your 3rd year," McGonagall said. "The planning began before the potions did." The fire was the only sound for a moment. Harry looked at the 3 vials on the desk. He looked at the labels. The one nearest him read HP Standard. Morning Administration. Prequidditch Practice. The handwriting was neat and familiar and utterly clinical, and the clinical quality of it was somehow worse than anything else, worse than the deception, worse than the scale of it, because it meant that somewhere in Ginny Weasley's mind this had never been a betrayal. It had been a project. Something managed and recorded and assessed for efficacy. "What happens now?" Harry asked. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. McGonagall sat down behind her desk. "Now several things happen simultaneously, which is why I wanted you in here rather than in the hall." She folded her hands on the desk with the deliberateness of someone choosing their words carefully. "The Hogwarts Board of Governors will be notified. Ministry protocols for non-consensual potion administration are extensive and serious. The Auror office will be involved within the day." Ron pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He'd been doing this periodically since he sat down, the gesture of a person trying to physically prevent themselves from seeing something more clearly. "She's 16, he said, from behind his hands. "She's still 16. "Age is a consideration the ministry will weigh," McGonagall said. "It's not a consideration that changes what was done." Ron's hands came down. He looked at McGonagall with an expression that Harry had only seen once before, during the chess game in 1st year, when Ron had seen 3 moves ahead to a sacrifice he didn't want to make but couldn't find a way around. "I know," he said. "Just that." "I want to be clear about something," McGonagall said, and her voice dropped slightly into something more personal, the way it occasionally did when she chose, consciously and deliberately, to step out of the role of professor and speak as a human being. What was administered to Harry over what appears to be a period of 2 years, possibly longer given the tolerance adjustment notations, constitutes a serious crime under wizarding law. Amortentia administered without consent falls under the Potions Poisoning Act of 1947. The fact that the motivation was, she paused, choosing her word with visible care, romantic in nature does not diminish the legal or personal gravity. Hermione, Harry said without turning his head, when you said the full force of it might hit me later, yes. How much later? She looked at him carefully, the way she'd been looking at him all morning, like she was monitoring something delicate. There's no standard timeline. It depends on how the potion was administered, how often, at what concentrations. The records in the trunk, she stopped. We should look at those records. McGonagall opened her desk drawer and produced a leather-bound notebook. She set it on the desk beside the vials and did not open it. Harry looked at it. It was a perfectly ordinary school notebook, the kind sold at Scrivenshafts in Hogsmeade, brown leather cover, brass clasp. The clasp had a small charm on it that he could feel from across the desk, a recognition ward, he thought. The kind that would refuse the wrong set of hands. I used an Alohomora variant, McGonagall said, which answered the question he hadn't asked. It's open. I haven't read beyond the first page, because what's written there is, another pause. McGonagall, Harry realized, was doing something he'd rarely observed her do. She was having feelings about something in front of students, and she was not quite managing to contain them fully. I thought you should see it first. Harry reached forward and opened the notebook. The first page was a title of sorts. Centered on the page, in that same neat clinical handwriting, underlined twice, HJP, Administration Log. Begun June 1994. Below it, in smaller writing, for when he's ready to love me properly. Harry read that line twice. He read it a third time. He set the notebook down on the desk without speaking and looked at the fire for a moment and breathed. For when he's ready, Ron said, from beside him. He'd leaned over to read it too. His voice was strange, not loud, not tight, but threaded through with something that had no name. Like you were the problem. Like you just weren't, he stopped. Pressed his hands against the table. Like you were the one who needed fixing. She believed that, Hermione said, quietly. I think she genuinely believed that. She wasn't defending it, her voice carried no warmth for the idea, but she was naming it precisely, the way she named things. That's what makes it worse, Harry said. Yeah. I know. Because a person who knew they were doing wrong could, theoretically, choose differently. A person who believed they were correcting an error, who had written out their logic in a leather notebook with a brass clasp and filed it neatly under administration log, that person was operating from a completely different internal architecture. One where Harry's actual feelings, whatever they might have been, were simply incorrect and required adjustment. He flipped forward in the notebook with a careful deliberateness, the way you lift a bandage quickly because slow is worse. The pages were dense. Dated entries, each one methodical. June 6, 1994, Initial Administration. Standard dilution, 0.3 milliliters in pumpkin juice at breakfast. Subject appeared, he stopped reading specific entries and skimmed instead, taking in the structure of it. The entries continued daily for the first month, then shifted to 3 times weekly, with notes about concentration adjustments, notes about his behavior that were written with the same neutral precision as a potions essay, observations about the efficacy of particular doses noted in terms that made his skin feel wrong. Between 4th and 5th year, the concentration had tripled. There was a note beside the increase, dated August 1995, tolerance building as expected. Increasing to maintain baseline effect. Slight irritability noted, may be stress-related, unconnected to potion withdrawal. Monitor. He was an experiment. A long-running, carefully documented experiment in the chemistry of manufactured feeling, and somewhere in the pages of this notebook was a record of every version of himself he'd been for the past 2 years that he no longer trusted as his own. Harry, Hermione said. He closed the notebook. I want to look at all of it, he said. Not right now. But I want to look at all of it. Of course. I want to know every date. Every dose. I want to be able to look at my own history and know which parts were real. McGonagall nodded slowly. That's your right. We'll make the records available to you in full. She paused. I should tell you, there are other recipients in the trunk. The logs are separated by initial. HP is the primary log, by volume. But there are others. Who? Hermione asked. I only looked as far as was necessary to confirm the scope. McGonagall's voice was careful. There are logs for 6 other individuals. 3 of them are students. 2 are, she hesitated. Former students. And 1 is an adult who is currently employed at this school. The room went very still. A professor? Harry said. That is something I will be addressing separately and urgently, McGonagall said, in a tone that closed the door on that particular line of inquiry for the moment. For now, the focus is on you and on ensuring you have access to everything you need. Hermione, I'd like your assistance cataloging the vials. Your knowledge of the chemistry is, she glanced at Harry. It will be useful in determining the exact composition and how long the effects will take to clear naturally. I can do that, Hermione said. Good. McGonagall looked at Ron. Ron. I need to tell you that the ministry notification will go to your parents as well as the headmaster. Your mother and father will be informed today. Ron sat very still. I'm not asking you to choose anything, McGonagall said, and her voice had gentled slightly, the kind of gentling she managed without making anything soft. I'm telling you so you're not blindsided. Does she know yet? Ron asked. His voice was neutral in a way that was clearly costing him. Ginny. Does she know what's been shown? She was in the Great Hall. She saw what everyone saw. But does she know the trunk has been secured? Does she know about the notebook? McGonagall's expression said what her voice didn't need to. She knows enough to understand the situation is serious. Ron nodded once. He looked at Harry. There was a conversation happening in that look, not the specific vocabulary of it, not the particular words, but the underlying current of it, the thing that 7 years of friendship does to 2 people, which is build a language between them that operates below the reach of whatever is currently making speech difficult. What Ron's look said was, I don't know how to be in this yet. I need you to know that whatever I do next isn't a verdict on you. And what Harry's look back said was, I know. Go. I'll be here. Ron stood up. I need to find somewhere to think, he said. The prefect's bathroom is likely empty at this hour, McGonagall said, without any irony. 2nd floor. You know the password. Ron looked faintly surprised that she knew he'd used it before, then apparently decided that McGonagall probably knew a great many things she never mentioned, and left. The door closed behind him, and Harry looked back at the notebook on the desk. I need to do something useful, he said. I can't just sit here. McGonagall looked at him steadily. What did you have in mind? Hermione and I go through the records. All of them. We document what was in those vials, what the concentration levels mean, what the full timeline looks like. Not for the ministry, they'll do their own work. For me. He met her eyes. I need to understand what was real. I can give you 2 hours before the headmaster needs to be involved. McGonagall said it plainly, the way she said most things. 2 hours in which you have access to the secured trunk and all its contents, under my supervision, to document and review. 3 hours, Harry said. She looked at him. 3 hours, he repeated. Not asking. After a moment, the very smallest almost smile crossed her face. 3 hours, she agreed. They set up in McGonagall's office, because she refused to have the evidence moved to an unsecured location and because her office, Harry reflected, was probably safer than anywhere short of the room of requirement. The trunk had been brought up and sealed with a temporary ministry standard stasis charm, visible as a faint blue shimmer around its edges, but McGonagall dissolved it with a tap of her wand, and it swung open. Harry had expected to feel something dramatic when it opened. A surge of something, anger, or grief, or the specific nausea of violated trust. What he felt instead was considerably more interesting. He felt curious. Not in a distant, academic way, but with the sharp-focused energy of someone who has been lost in fog and can finally see the territory clearly and wants to understand every inch of it. "Right," Hermione said beside him, pulling out the small notebook she kept in her robe pocket and a self-inking quill. Her tone had shifted into the register she saved for serious intellectual work, clear, fast, unsentimental. Harry had always loved this about her. When things were at their most difficult, she became most herself. "Let's start with the vials. We need to categorize them by recipient, by date range, and by concentration. Then the notebook, which we cross-reference against the vials to confirm the administration record is accurate." "You think she might have falsified the records?" "I think it's worth confirming they match the physical evidence." Hermione was already lifting a vial and holding it to the light. "Amortentia leaves a chemical signature that a competent potions analysis can read. Each batch will have slight variations, small differences in brewing time, ingredient quality, temperature. If we match those signatures to the notebook entries, we can verify the timeline independently." Harry looked at her. "When did you learn how to do that?" "Sixth Year Potions, Chapter 9. She said it without looking up. "I read ahead." Harry reached into the trunk. The first layer was the vials, hundreds of them, packed with the careful density of someone who'd had years to develop a system. They were sorted by a color-coded stopper, dark green for high concentration, amber for standard, pale yellow for trace amounts. The organization was meticulous. It was the organization of someone who had lived with this for so long it had become routine. Who had incorporated this particular horror so thoroughly into the fabric of daily life that it had its own storage system. He lifted a dark green vial and looked at the label. HP, high concentration. 2.1 milliliters, August 1996. Return to Hogwarts, anticipating tolerance spike from Summer Gap. Summer Gap, he said, almost to himself. Hermione looked over. "Read the label." She accounted for the potion clearing during summers. When she couldn't administer it. She would have expected your feelings toward her to change during the summers, and then she'd ramp the dosage back up when term began. She paused. That's why every September always felt different," Harry finished. He set the vial down carefully. "Every September with her, it always felt like falling into something. I thought it was, the potion re-stimulating an already compromised system," Hermione said, quietly and without any satisfaction whatsoever. He sat with that. Every September. 3 Septembers he could now reframe in a single sentence. They worked through it methodically, the way they'd always worked best together, him pulling information from the physical evidence, her cross-referencing and documenting, both of them building a picture that got clearer and more detailed and more sickening with every vial they catalogued. Harry found himself in a strange state of mind that he didn't entirely understand, fiercely focused, almost cold, and underneath all of that, getting steadily more alive, like sensation returning to a limb that's been asleep. That was the thing nobody told you about being dosed with Amortentia, or maybe it was something nobody could tell you until you experienced the clearing of it, which was that it wasn't just that your feelings about the source of the potion were manufactured. It was that your entire relationship with your own judgment was compromised. The potion didn't just tell you to feel warmly about Ginny Weasley. It told you that the warm feeling was the reliable one. That the discomfort, the wrongness, the sense of something off, those were the things that needed dismissing. It installed a kind of inverse logic, trust the fog, distrust the clarity. He'd been living under that inversion for 2 years, and the inversion was lifting now, and everything he touched was becoming more real. There's a separate section, Hermione said, about 40 minutes in. She was holding a divider she'd found halfway down the trunk, a piece of stiff parchment with the letter O written on it in the same neat hand. "Oh," Harry said. Not a student. Not a current one, anyway. She lifted the divider and found another organized row of vials, these with different stoppers, violet-colored, and smaller, as if the doses were more modest. She lifted one and read the label, and her face went very still. "Oh," she said. "Who?" She turned the vial so he could read it. "OW." The label below the initials had more detail than his own had, as if the subject required more specific documentation. And beneath that, standard. Discretionary. Ensure compliant disposition toward H. Harry stared at it. Ensure compliant disposition toward H, he read aloud. He stopped. Started again. She was dosing someone else to make them more favorable toward me. So that whoever this person is, Hermione said, slowly, they would support Ginny's relationship with you. Would encourage it. Would not raise concerns. She set the vial down with extraordinary care. That's a level of planning that goes significantly beyond, it's a conspiracy, Harry said. The word landed flat and accurate. She wasn't just managing how I felt. She was managing the environment around me. Hermione looked at the OW vials for a long moment without speaking. Then, Oliver would graduated 2 years ago. They looked at each other. He was Quidditch captain, Harry said. He would have had significant influence over you. Over your schedule. Over how much time you spent on the pitch, away from people who might have noticed something was wrong. Hermione's voice was doing its careful, analytical work, but her hands had tightened around her quill. If she could make him favorably disposed, he wouldn't raise concerns. He'd keep the routine stable. She was building a container, Harry said. Around me. People who'd been, adjusted, to keep the conditions right. The fire had burned lower. Outside, the morning had moved on without them, the way mornings did regardless of what was happening in specific offices with locked doors and secured evidence. Harry could hear the distant sounds of the castle, footsteps, the muffled bell for first period, and felt the peculiar dislocation of sitting inside a different timeline than the one the school was currently living in. Are there more dividers? He asked. Hermione looked. 3 more. She handed them to him. He read the initials on each one, and as he read them, several things he'd been half-knowing for years assembled themselves into a coherent picture with the decisive click of a solved puzzle. RW control sample. Familial bond, monitor for interference. Ron. She'd had a section for Ron. Not for dosing him, apparently, control sample suggested she'd been monitoring rather than administering, but for tracking his influence on Harry and assessing the risk of that influence disrupting things. She'd been tracking her own brother as a variable in an experiment. She was watching him to see if he'd notice, Harry said. Yes. Hermione's voice had something very cold in it. She knew Ron is the person most likely to notice something wrong with you. And she kept records on when his influence over you seemed to be increasing, presumably so she could counteract it. Harry set the divider down. He thought about how many times over the past 2 years he'd felt a vague, inexplicable irritation with Ron about nothing specific. A low-grade friction that had no cause and disappeared as quickly as it came. He thought about how he'd attributed it to the stress of various crises, to the natural friction of long friendship, to 100 reasonable explanations that had never quite accounted for the specific texture of it. She was managing the dosage around his influence, Harry said. When Ron was particularly present. When he was particularly himself. She'd increase the concentration to compensate. Probably, yes. Harry looked at his own hands for a moment. Then he stood up, crossed to McGonagall's window, and looked out at the Quidditch pitch in the distance. The morning sun had fully arrived now, the kind of sharp autumnal light that made everything look precisely itself, all its edges clear, no softness anywhere. He'd had his first kiss on the back of that pitch. Under the stands, after a match, when the rest of the team had already gone in. He'd replayed that moment 100 times. Had held on to it as evidence of something genuine, something his, something that proved he was capable of ordinary human feeling despite everything. He looked at the pitch and tried to remember how that moment had actually felt. Not how he'd interpreted it afterward, not how it fit into the narrative he'd built around it, but the actual physical emotional reality of it, standing there in the cold with the noise of the crowd dying away and her arms around his neck. He'd felt warm. He'd felt certain. He'd felt completely, absolutely sure. He'd been dosed 3 times that week. He could see it in the notebook, the notation from that very morning, HP, high concentration. Match day. Ensure positive affective state. He put his forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. Behind him, Hermione said nothing, because she understood that there were moments when saying nothing was the only correct response, and she'd always known which kind of moment she was in. After a while, Harry straightened up. "The other 2 initials," he said. "Tell me." Hermione had been reading ahead while he stood at the window, which was also very Hermione. "One is DT," she said carefully. "The logs for this one are different, the dosage is much lighter and the notes indicate the intent was to manage," she read directly from the label. "Maintain low effect, minimal romantic interest toward H." Harry turned around. "She was dosing someone to reduce their feelings toward me?" "To manage competition," Hermione said. "Whoever DT is," she paused. "Daphne Terrence?" "No, she was Hufflepuff." "Could be, Demelza Thomas." Or, she stopped. "Harry. Demi Torres. She was in your defense against the dark arts class in 5th year. Muggle-born, Ravenclaw. You helped her with a Patronus charm." Harry remembered her vaguely. A quiet girl, dark hair, quick with counter-curses. She'd thanked him after class once and he'd felt nothing, he'd felt absolutely nothing, a blankness in place of what might have been normal social awareness, a wall where a window might have been. "She was containing me," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "She was containing me on all sides. Dosing me to increase my feelings toward her. Dosing people in my orbit to manage their influence. Dosing potential competitors to reduce the risk. She built he searched for the word. An environment," Hermione said softly. "She built a controlled environment. Across 3 years. At minimum." Harry crossed back to the desk and picked up the administration log. He opened it to a random page, October 1995, high concentration, note, H appears more present this week, suggesting last month's increase was effective. Maintaining current dosage. Good progress. He read it and felt the cold fury of it, clean and specific, running through him without heat. He was not going to break anything. He was not going to shout. He was going to know, as completely as possible, and then he was going to decide what to do with what he knew. He flipped to the last entry. It was dated 4 days ago. HP, Standard Plus. Morning. He seems distant lately. Hard to read. Considering increasing to high concentration next week. Need to be careful, if he's building further tolerance this needs a different approach. Possibly time to consider long-term compound formula. Research required. She was planning to escalate, Harry said. Hermione had come to read over his shoulder. The long-term compound formula she mentions, that's a permanent bonding variant. It's not a love potion anymore at that point, it's she stopped. Say it. It's closer to a mind-altering substance. It doesn't just generate positive feelings, it starts to rewrite preference. Permanently. With enough sustained exposure. She said it with the flatness of someone delivering a medical prognosis they wish they weren't making. She was moving towards something that would have been irreversible. The word sat in the room between them. Irreversible. Harry closed the notebook. He set it down on the desk with a careful precision that had nothing to do with gentleness and everything to do with control. He straightened up. He looked at Hermione. I'm going to need a potions purge, he said. Whatever you need to brew, whatever the procedure is for clearing this properly. I want to do it today. The standard detoxification formula is available in the hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey can, today, Harry said. Not tomorrow. Not after the ministry meetings and the Board of Governors notification and whatever institutional machinery is about to start grinding. Today. Before anything else. Hermione looked at him for a long moment, assessing. Then she nodded. I'll brew it myself, she said. I don't want any interruptions from the standard medical process. Give me an hour with the potion stores and I can have something ready that's more specifically calibrated to amortentia exposure at this concentration. You can brew a specific detox for amortentia in an hour. I've been reading about it for 20 minutes, she said, with the absolute simplicity of someone who read 20 minutes faster than everyone else. I know what it requires. It's not complicated, it just needs to be done carefully. He almost said something warm then. Something about being glad she was here, about what it meant to have her in his corner, about all the specific and important ways in which she was one of the very few things in his life he was completely certain had been real. He didn't say any of it, because she already knew, and because she was Hermione, and saying it out loud right now would have made her cry and would have possibly made him cry, and neither of them needed that right now. Go, he said instead. She went. McGonagall returned 20 minutes after Hermione left. She looked at the documented catalogue spread across her desk, at the organized rows of vials, at the administration log open to its last entry, and she sat down heavily in her chair with the posture of someone absorbing a blow they knew was coming. You've been thorough, she said. I had a good partner. She picked up the administration log. Read the last entry. Set it down again. Her jaw had tightened in a way that Harry recognized as the external evidence of considerable internal feeling being managed with great efficiency. I have to tell you something, she said, that I should have told you before now, and I want you to hear it without me making excuses, because the excuses exist but they don't matter. Harry sat down across from her. All right. There were concerns raised. Last year. She met his eyes without flinching from what she was going to say. A concern was raised about the nature of your relationship. About certain behavioral patterns that a staff member found unusual. This concern was brought to the headmaster. A pause. It was not investigated. Harry held perfectly still. Who raised the concern? Professor Snape. He blinked. Of all the things he'd expected her to say, that was not among them. He turned it over. Snape, who had despised him with the dedicated specificity of personal grievance for 5 years, who had been hostile and cutting and fundamentally adversarial in every interaction they'd had, Snape had looked at the situation and raised a concern that Dumbledore had then declined to investigate. Why didn't Dumbledore act on it? Harry asked. McGonagall's jaw tightened further. He determined that the evidence was insufficient. That the behavior changes in question could be explained by the stress of your circumstances. The war. The prophecy. A pause. He may also have found the situation politically complex. Given the Weasley family's relationship with the Order. Given, she stopped. Given that it was convenient, Harry said. Not an accusation. An observation. A Harry Potter who was settled, who was managed. Who wasn't asking hard questions or going in unexpected directions. Who was emotionally invested in people who were embedded in the Order's inner circle. He said it without heat. I understand the logic. The logic was wrong, McGonagall said, and her voice had a severity in it that was entirely directed inward. I should have pushed harder. When Severus brought the concern to me afterward, when he told me it had been dismissed, I should have investigated independently. I chose to defer to the headmaster's judgment. That was my failure. Harry looked at her. He thought about all the ways this information could hurt him, all the directions it could send him, the anger at Dumbledore, the betrayal of the institution, the specific and particular grief of learning that the person he trusted most as a guide had known something was wrong and found it inconvenient to address. He felt the shape of all of that. He didn't feel ready to carry it yet. "I'll deal with Dumbledore separately," he said. "Right now I need to know, is Snape in the castle today?" McGonagall looked briefly surprised, which was unusual for her. "He's teaching. 4th years until 10. I want to talk to him after that. I can arrange it." "Not as a student in a professor's office," Harry said. "Just, somewhere neutral. Tell him I'd like to speak with him." McGonagall regarded him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "I'll tell him," she said. Outside, the school bell rang for the end of first period, and Harry heard the distant thunder of 600 students redistributing themselves through stone corridors, and he thought about the great hall ceiling still displaying its rose-gold constellation above 4 breakfast tables, and he thought about Ron sitting somewhere quiet with the weight of his family in his hands, and he thought about the administration log with its last entry and the word irreversible that Hermione had said and the window it had narrowly been, and then he put all of that in a place where he kept things that needed to wait, and he went to find somewhere to sit in the sun until Hermione came back with the thing that would finish clearing his own mind back to himself. He found a window seat in an empty classroom off the second-floor corridor, south-facing, full of morning light, a view of the lake through the glass. He sat in it and let the sun fall on his face and thought about nothing with great deliberateness. The lake was silver and restless. A pair of owls crossed the sky above it heading north, going somewhere specific with specific purpose, unbothered by anything happening inside the castle below. He watched them until they were gone. He would be fine. He knew this the way he knew most things about himself, not through reasoning but through the solid insistence of his own character, which had been bent and pressured and manufactured and constrained but had not, it turned out, been extinguished. It was still here. He was still here. He was, in fact, more here than he'd been in years. The sun was warm on his face. He waited for Hermione to come back, and he wasn't afraid, and the sky outside the window was honest and bright and belonging to no one. Chapter 3, The Lions and the Wolves. Hermione found him in the empty classroom at 10:30, carrying a small stoppered vial of something silver blue and a look on her face that said she'd had an eventful hour in the potion stores. Snape was there, she said, closing the door behind her. In the stores. He didn't interfere. He just watched me work for about 10 minutes and then left without saying anything. Did he say anything before he left? He said my calcification ratio was off and then corrected it himself. She set the vial on the windowsill beside Harry. Which, when I checked his adjustment, was actually right. So Snape helped you brew the thing that undoes what his concern was about. Apparently. She sat down across from him on the opposite side of the deep windowsill, pulling her knees up. The morning light was doing something particular to the lake outside, turning it a hammered pewter, and they sat with it for a moment in the way they'd learned to sit with things together. It's ready. It won't taste good. Harry picked up the vial. Examined it. The liquid had a faint luminescence, silver blue fading to clear at the edges, and it moved with slightly more viscosity than water. What does it do? It accelerates the metabolic clearing of amortentia compounds from your system. Without it, the full residual effects can take 2 to 3 weeks to clear at the concentration levels you were receiving. With it, she paused. It'll be faster. Hours, probably. But Harry, I need to warn you. The process isn't comfortable. How not comfortable? The manufactured feelings don't clear quietly. They surface first. Before they go, they amplify. Briefly. She was watching his face carefully. You'll feel, very strongly, the things the potion was generating. And then you'll feel them leave. And what comes after that is yours. He turned the vial in his fingers. How long is briefly? 20 minutes, maybe 30. I'll stay with you. He looked at her. You don't have to, Harry. The single syllable had no patience in it. Obviously I'm staying. He pulled the stopper. The smell hit him first, something green and cold, like a forest after rain, completely unlike Amortentia's well-documented ability to smell like whatever most attracted you. This smelled like clarity. Like weather. He drank it in one go, because drawing it out was never better with anything unpleasant. It tasted like cold iron and something faintly sweet underneath, and then it hit his chest like a wave from the inside. Hermione watched him, her expression steady and her hands folded, and Harry gripped the edge of the windowsill and felt the first surge of it. It came the way she'd said, amplified, total, the manufactured warmth sweeping up from somewhere below conscious feeling and presenting itself with the absolute conviction of something genuine. He felt, for about 90 seconds, completely certain that he loved Ginny Weasley. Not as an idea but as a physical fact, warm and specific and terrifyingly persuasive, and he understood in those 90 seconds why nobody who was dosed could simply reason their way out of it, because reason had nothing to do with it. It was more real feeling than anything he'd felt in years, and it was entirely false, and both of those things were simultaneously true, and holding both of them at once was the hardest thing he'd done since standing in a graveyard at 14. Then it crested. And then it broke. The warmth didn't so much leave as withdraw, like a tide pulling back from a shoreline, and what it revealed was the actual landscape underneath, not empty, not nothing, but different. Quieter. Genuinely his own, which meant it was less certain and less dramatic and considerably less orchestrated than what had just vacated it, but it was real in the way that mattered, the way that something real is real even when it's small. He breathed. "Harry," Hermione said. "Give me a second." He sat with it. The absence of the manufactured thing was strange, like a sound you've been hearing so long you stopped registering it, and then it stops, and the silence is almost alarming. He looked inward at where the warmth had been and found something much cooler and more complex, a tangled thing that included genuine affection for certain people, appropriate concern for others, a complete lack of the specific certainty he'd been living with, and underneath all of it, a bedrock of himself that had been there the whole time. "Okay," he said, after a while. "Okay." He met her eyes. "I don't think I was ever in love with her. Even before the potions, even accounting for what was real. I think I was, I think I thought she was remarkable, and I think being near her felt good because it was chemically engineered to, and at some point I stopped being able to tell the difference between the two." Hermione was quiet. "I don't feel devastated," he said. "I expected to feel devastated." "You feel angry," she said, observing rather than telling him. "Yes. That's appropriate." "I feel clear," he said, and the word came out with a force that surprised him, like it had been under pressure. "I feel like myself. I can't remember the last time I felt specifically like myself." Hermione made a small sound that she covered immediately, pressing her mouth together. Her eyes were bright. "Good," she said, in a voice that was doing considerable work to remain level. "That's good." He could have hugged her. He didn't, because they were both pretending they weren't on the verge of some sort of emotional event, which was the right call for the moment. "Right," he said instead. "What's happening in the castle?" She straightened up, grateful for the redirect. "I came through the second-floor corridor on the way here. It's loud. Not physically loud, but the kind of loud where you can hear people not talking about something. Everyone knows. The whole school is. I don't know if you've ever seen 600 people sharing a secret in real time, but it has a specific quality." "And Ginny?" Hermione's expression shifted. "That's the other thing." She paused. "She's been talking to people." Harry went still. "What kind of talking?" "The strategic kind." Hermione's voice was carefully neutral. "I heard about it secondhand. Parvati told Lavender who told Seamus who told Neville. She's been working her way through Gryffindor, and the version she's presenting it's sophisticated. She's not denying the potions. She's reframing them." "Reframing them how?" "She's calling them a mistake made out of," she said, overwhelming feelings. She said she panicked, that she found something she'd made years ago and she'd never actually used it, that the trunk was from a confused period and she'd forgotten it was there, that if there's anything in the logs it's... Hermione stopped. She said the logs were theoretical. Academic interest in potions. That she documented hypothetically. Harry looked at her for a long, level moment. She's calling a 2-year administration log theoretical. She's very good at it, Hermione said, and the acknowledgement carried no admiration, only the particular respect you afford a serious problem. She's crying. Not, obvious crying. The kind that looks like she's trying not to. And she's framing you as the... She stopped again. Say it. She's suggesting that you're reacting disproportionately. That you're choosing to believe the worst about someone who loves you, and that it's a pattern, that you push people away when they get close, that this is a trauma response. Hermione met his eyes. She said it gently. That's what makes it effective. She's not attacking you. She's making people feel sorry for her and worried about you simultaneously. Harry absorbed this. He thought about the notebook, its last entry, the word irreversible. He thought about ensure compliant disposition and monitor for interference and the methodical patience of 3 years of daily record keeping. He thought about the specific quality of intelligence it took to manage that and also to stand in a common room 10 minutes after being exposed and begin shaping the narrative in a direction that made the victim the problem. She's not panicking, he said. She's working. Yes. And people are buying it. Hermione hesitated. Some people are willing to buy it. Which isn't quite the same thing. She shifted on the windowsill. There's a difference between genuinely believing her and wanting to believe her because the alternative is harder. Ginny is, she searched for the right word. She's been in this house for 5 years. People love her. She's funny and brave and she's had a hard history, the Chamber of Secrets, everyone knows about that. So when she says she's the one who needs understanding, some people's instinct is to give it to her. Harry stood up from the windowsill. The sun had moved while they'd been sitting there, the light changing its angle, and he felt the physical reality of standing up, the specific solidity of his own body and his own judgment fully returned to him. I'm going to the common room, he said. Hermione stood too, immediately. Okay. You don't need to, I'm going to the common room, she said, in a tone that indicated this was not a debatable position. They walked together through the stone corridors, and Harry noticed the school in a way he hadn't in some time, the specific details of it, the way the light fell through narrow windows onto flagged floors, the distant sound of a lesson in progress behind a closed door, the smell of old stone and wood polish and the particular atmospheric weight of a building that had been full of young people's anxieties for several centuries. He'd always loved Hogwarts, had always felt it as the realest home he had, and he felt that love now as his own thing, uncomplicated and straightforwardly true. The portrait hole was closed when they reached it. Neville was standing outside it, which was unusual, with the expression he wore when he was trying to be calming and finding it difficult. Harry, he said, with the directness of someone who decided not to do small talk. It's a lot in there right now. I know. Neville looked at him with the specific appraisal of someone who has been Harry Potter's dormitory roommate for 5 years. You seem, he searched for the word. Clear. I am. Neville nodded slowly, and something in his posture settled. Right, then, he said, as if this resolved something, and stepped aside. The fat lady swung open on a scene that justified Neville's warning. The Gryffindor common room was never quiet, it was a house that ran on noise and physical presence, couches perpetually occupied, fire perpetually lit, some ongoing argument always in progress somewhere, but what Harry walked into was noise of a different quality. Pockets of intense conversation, voices pitched low and urgent, the social topology of a group trying to process something that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. Several second years near the fire looked up with the wide-eyed attention of people watching something they don't entirely understand. A group of fourth years near the stairs had fallen silent the moment the portrait swung open. Ginny was on the far side of the room, sitting on the arm of a sofa next to Katie Bell, with 3 or 4 other Gryffindors arranged around her in the clustering posture of people offering comfort. She looked up when Harry walked in. The look she gave him across the common room was the second honest thing he'd seen from her today, and it was nothing like the first. The first had been a loss of control, the mask cracking. This was different. This was the look of someone who had made a calculation and was committing to it. Her eyes were bright with the particular luminosity of recent tears, her expression soft and open and wounded, and it was a performance. Harry understood that now with complete clarity, but it was a very good performance, constructed by someone who'd had years to perfect the relationship between her internal architecture and her external presentation. "Harry," she said, and made his name sound like an olive branch. 6 or 7 people looked between them. Harry walked across the common room toward her. Not hurrying, not aggressive, just moving with purpose and without hesitation, and he watched the calculation flicker in her eyes as she tried to read his approach and find the angle. He stopped 5 feet from the sofa and looked at her directly. "We need to talk," he said. "Not here." "Harry," Katie Bell started. "Not here," Harry said again, and his voice was steady and clear and carried no anger in it, which was more unsettling, he suspected, than anger would have been. "Just the 2 of us. There's a classroom on the 2nd floor that's empty." Ginny looked at him for a moment. He could see the calculation, whether to refuse, what refusing would communicate, whether compliance or resistance served her narrative better right now. She made her choice with impressive speed. "Okay," she said, and her voice was full of quiet hurt, the voice of someone bravely agreeing to a difficult conversation they didn't deserve. She stood and the cluster of Gryffindors shifted around her. Katie's hand found Ginny's arm briefly in a gesture of support, and Harry watched it happen and understood how thoroughly the terrain had been shaped in the last hour. "I'm coming," Hermione said, from behind Harry. Ginny looked at Hermione and something moved through her face that was the most genuinely uncontrolled thing Harry had seen from her yet. Not fear, exactly, but the specific assessment that happens when someone understands that the game they're playing has a very capable opponent. "Fine," Harry said. They went down through the portrait hole and through the corridor and into the empty classroom, not Harry's south-facing one with the lake view, but a different one on the same floor, lit by a gray diffuse light that suited the occasion better. Hermione closed the door. Harry turned around. Ginny spoke first. "I know how this looks," she said. Her voice was controlled and warm, pitched at the register of genuine distress without the shrillness that might undermine her. "I know the ceiling, I know what everyone saw. And I need you to know that I am so sorry, Harry. I am so sorry you had to find out that way." "You're sorry about how I found out," Harry said. "I'm sorry about all of it." She took a step forward, and there was something in the movement that was pure instinct, the body doing what years of practice had taught it, moving toward him, closing the distance, using proximity the way she'd always used it. I was a mess, when I started. I was 13 and I was, Ginny." His voice didn't rise. "Stop." She stopped. "Read his face." He watched the recalibration happen. "The log says June 1994, Harry said. "You were 13. That's when you started the record keeping. The planning started before that." He let that sit for a moment, not as an accusation but as a correction. "This is the actual geography of what happened. We're starting from there. The last entry in the log is 4 days ago. You're 16 now. That's not a mess from when you were 13. That's a project." Ginny's eyes went very still. The wounded softness didn't entirely leave her face, it had been practiced too long to vanish completely, but underneath it something else was now visible, something considerably more alert. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. "I know," Harry said. "I think that's true. I think the particular horror of this is that you genuinely believe you were helping. That you were, correcting an error. That whatever I might have actually felt was the problem, and what you made me feel was the solution." He watched her face. "The notebook says for when he's ready to love me properly. That's not a statement about hurting me. That's a statement about my own feelings being wrong and yours being the standard. Something crossed Ginny's face then that was different from anything preceding it. He couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't quite guilt, because guilt required an acceptance of wrongdoing that she hadn't arrived at, but it was something adjacent to it. Something like the first fracture in a wall that has been solid for a very long time. "You've been planning to move to the compound formula," Hermione said from behind Harry, in her analytical voice, the voice that stripped everything to its components. "The last entry mentions researching a long-term compound variant. We know what that would have done. We know what irreversible means." Ginny looked at Hermione and said nothing. "I want to know one thing," Harry said. "Not for the Ministry. Not for whatever happens next. For me." He held her gaze. "Did you ever, was there a point, any point in any of this, where you asked yourself whether what I actually felt was worth anything? Whether the real version of me, the one with his own actual feelings, deserved to make his own choices?" The silence that followed was long and strange and had a texture to it. Ginny looked at him, and Harry looked back, and something in her face moved through several expressions too quickly to catalogue and arrived at something that might, in different circumstances, with different history, have been called genuine. Her jaw shifted. Her eyes went bright in a way that wasn't performance. "I thought," she said, and her voice had lost its careful warmth, had become something smaller and rawer, "that if you could just feel what I felt for you, then everything would be." She stopped. "I thought it would fix things. I thought you couldn't see it yet." "You thought I was wrong," Harry said. "About my own feelings." Her mouth pressed together. "I wasn't wrong," Harry said. "I was dosed. There's a difference." The door opened and Ron was standing in the doorway. He'd clearly been somewhere quiet, as McGonagall suggested, and whatever he'd done with the last few hours had left marks on his face that Harry didn't like seeing, a hollowed quality around his eyes, a set to his jaw that was the expression of someone who has rehearsed something difficult and is now standing in the moment of doing it. He looked at Ginny. "Mum's been sent a letter," he said. He was talking to Ginny but his voice was directed at the floor. "McGonagall sent one to Dad at the Ministry too." He stopped. "Tried again. I looked for the counter-evidence, Gin. I want you to know that. I sat in that bathroom for 2 hours looking for the version of this that made sense." Another stop. His voice was very careful and very raw, the voice of someone walking across something that might break. "There isn't one. Is there?" Ginny looked at her brother, and for the first time since the ceiling had broken open this morning, she looked young. 16 and entirely exposed, the architecture of her control insufficient against the specific weight of Ron's eyes, because Ron was the one person for whom she'd apparently never fully prepared a face. "I was going to stop," she said, and even as she said it Harry could hear that she knew how it sounded. "When?" Ron asked. "Just that." She didn't answer. Ron nodded, once, with the finality of someone who asked a question already knowing they wouldn't like the answer but needing to ask it anyway. He looked at Harry. Something passed between them, the same wordless conversation as in McGonagall's office, but different in quality now, more settled. Ron crossed the room and stood beside Harry, and the positioning of it was not aggressive but it was completely unambiguous. Ginny looked at the two of them standing together and she looked at Hermione on Harry's other side and she looked at the door she'd walked through thinking she might shape what happened in this room, and her expression did something final and quiet, like a door closing. "I need to speak to my family," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "You do." "And then," she started. "And then the Ministry," Harry said. "And the Board of Governors. And Madame Pomfrey and the other recipients and all the rest of it." His voice was not unkind. It was simply complete. "You understand that none of that is something I'm doing to you. It's just, what this is now." She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever she was looking for, she either found it or gave up looking. She walked to the door, and she opened it, and she paused with her hand on the frame but she didn't turn back, and then she was gone. The three of them stood in the empty classroom in the gray diffuse light. Ron let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for several hours. He sat on the edge of a desk, heavily, and put his hands between his knees and looked at the floor. "She was always smarter than me," he said, after a while. Not about everything. But about people. Reading people, managing situations. I always knew that. I just never," he shook his head. "I always thought it was just personality." "It is personality," Harry said. He sat on a desk nearby. "It's also something she turned in a particular direction." "How long have you known something was off?" Harry thought about the answer honestly. "I always felt, there was always something I couldn't put a name to. Something that felt wrong around the edges. I dismissed it." He paused. "The potion tells you to dismiss it. That's part of what it does." Ron was quiet for a moment. "Were you going to break up with her? Before this?" It was such an honest question, asked in such an honest way, that it deserved an honest answer. Harry thought back to himself as he'd been this morning, 3 hours ago, which felt like a different century, and tried to reconstruct what had been real in that version of himself. "I didn't know what I wanted," he said carefully. "Which I now understand differently than I did this morning." Ron nodded. "Right." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Harry, the other people she dosed. The ones in the trunk. We need to talk to them," Hermione said. "Carefully and privately, not in the middle of the school processing everything. They deserve to know." "Oliver would," Ron said. He'd clearly read more of the labels in the Great Hall than Harry had registered. "She dosed Oliver Wood. To keep Quidditch routine stable," Hermione said. "To ensure you stayed in your patterns and didn't get disrupted from the conditions she'd set up around you." Ron made a sound that expressed a very large number of things in a very small register. "He's in London now. He's on the Puddlemere Reserve Squad. The Ministry will contact him," Harry said. "All of them? And the professor?" Ron looked at Hermione. "McGonagall said there was a professor." Hermione and Harry exchanged a glance. They discussed this, briefly, on the walk from the second floor, how much to say and to whom and when, in the knowledge that some information needed to move carefully through the particular machinery of institutional response before it became common knowledge. "McGonagall's handling it," Harry said. "That's all I'll say right now." Ron accepted this with a nod. He looked up at the classroom ceiling, plain stone, not enchanted, no rose gold light anywhere. "She's going to try to make it about her," he said. "When the Ministry comes. When Mum comes. She's going to be," he pressed his mouth together. "She's going to be the most believable version of herself, and it's going to be awful to watch." "I know," Harry said. "She's not evil," Ron said, and the saying of it clearly cost him something. "I don't think she's not like Voldemort or Umbridge or," he stopped at the name, the way people still sometimes stopped. She wanted something, and she decided that wanting it hard enough made it okay to take it." Nobody contradicted this. It was too accurate to contradict. "That's not nothing," Hermione said quietly. "What she did isn't nothing just because she's not," she gestured toward the space where the worst names lived. 2 years of non-consensual potion administration. The planning to escalate to a permanent compound. The dosing of other people to control the environment. "That's not, Ron, I love your family, and I know how hard this is, and I'm also telling you that what she did is serious and has a name, and that name isn't just a mistake." Ron met Hermione's eyes, and something in his expression indicated that this was exactly what he needed to hear and also exactly what he'd been dreading hearing, the specific combination of things that only landed when the right person said them. "I know," he said. "I know that." They sat together in the quiet classroom, 3 people who had been through too much together not to know how to be in difficult truces with reality, and the morning moved around them. It was Harry who spoke first, eventually. Not because he had the most important thing to say but because the moment had gathered enough weight that someone needed to move it forward. "I'm meeting with Snape this afternoon," he said. Both of his friends looked at him. He raised the concern a year ago. Dumbledore suppressed it. "I want to understand what he saw and when, and I want to decide what I think about Dumbledore separately from everything else." "Snape," Ron said. "Snape, who has been trying to fail you out of potions since first year. Snape, who apparently looked at my behavior and thought something was wrong and took it to the appropriate authority." Harry shrugged. "The world is strange." "The world is deeply strange," Ron agreed. "Will you be all right this afternoon?" Harry asked him. "When your mum gets the letter." Ron looked at the ceiling again. "No," he said, with the straightforward honesty that was his best quality. "But I'll be functional." "Which is, that'll have to do." Harry put his hand on Ron's shoulder for a moment, the same gesture as this morning, solid and present, and Ron closed his eyes briefly and then opened them and looked more like himself. "Right," Ron said, standing. "I should eat something. We missed breakfast." "There'll be food in the kitchens," Hermione said. "Right." He paused at the door. "Harry. Whatever happens this afternoon with Dumbledore, with all of it. Don't let them manage it. Don't let them make it smaller than it is." He looked at Harry with the directness of someone who has always, at his core, known where his loyalties lived. "You deserve the full truth. Not the version that's convenient." "I know," Harry said. Ron left. Hermione looked at Harry. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Eventually." "I know that too." She picked up her notes from where she'd set them on a desk. She'd been adding to them throughout the conversation in the small rapid shorthand she used when she didn't want anyone to see her documenting things, and tucked them away. "The Board of Governors meeting will probably be this evening," she said. "McGonagall will want you there. I'll be there. And the other recipients need to be told before it gets to them through the rumor chain. Demelza Torres is in advanced charms. I can find her before lunch. I'll come with you." "You don't have to, I was the reason she was targeted," Harry said. "I'll come." Hermione nodded. Then, because she could not entirely help herself and because she was Hermione and this was as close as she got to certain kinds of expression, "I noticed something this morning that I should tell you." "What?" "When the ceiling first showed the vials, before the chaos started, before anyone was really certain what they were looking at, you were the only person in the Great Hall who went completely still." She looked at him. Everyone else flinched or looked away or started talking. "You went still. And your face was," she paused. "Clear. Even then. Before the detox potion. Before we'd talked. You went still and you looked clear." Harry thought about this. "Part of you already knew," she said. "Part of you recognized it immediately, even through everything that was still in your system. Because that part of you was never," she stopped. "She took a lot from you. 2 years it's enormous. But she didn't take you. You were in there the whole time." The classroom was quiet around them, gray light and old stone, and Harry sat with what she'd said and let it be true. "Let's go find Demelza Torres," he said. They walked out into the corridor together, and the school moved around them, louder now that classes had turned over, the particular noise of Hogwarts at midday, hundreds of lives all happening at once in the contained specific world of the castle. Harry walked through it feeling each step as his own, feeling the stone under his feet and the castle air in his lungs and the very specific and unconstructed nature of his own mind, and it was unremarkable and it was ordinary and it was, he thought, the best thing he'd felt in years. Somewhere in the castle, Ginny Weasley was preparing for whatever came next, building her next position with the intelligence and fluency she'd always had. Somewhere in his office, Dumbledore was considering his next move. Somewhere in the dungeons, Snape was teaching fourth years with his characteristic acid precision, and had perhaps already decided what he was going to say that afternoon. Everything was moving. Harry moved through it without flinching, clear-eyed and fully present, following Hermione toward the part of the morning that needed doing next. The castle held them all, old and patient and entirely impartial, its ceiling in the great hall still showing the real sky above, the only honest mirror in the building, the one that had always told the truth. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. Before the staff, Snape was already in the room when Harry arrived. Not McGonagall's office, not a classroom. Snape had chosen the small stone anteroom off the potions corridor that most students didn't know existed, tucked behind a tapestry of dubious artistic merit depicting a wizard attempting to transfigure a badger into a teapot. The room itself was barely 10 feet square, lit by 2 wall sconces, furnished with a table and 4 chairs and nothing else. No portraits. No windows. No one to overhear. Harry noted the choice of location and respected it. Snape was standing rather than sitting, which was typical, his arms folded in the posture that had always communicated a comprehensive disdain for the current situation. He looked at Harry when Harry came in the way he always looked at Harry, with the specific intensity of someone who has been examining the same complicated subject for 6 years and still hasn't arrived at a settled conclusion. "Close the door," Snape said. Harry closed it. He pulled out a chair and sat down, because he wasn't going to stand for the next hour matching Snape's posture game for game. He'd long since moved past needing to perform in front of Severus Snape. "You look different," Snape said, after a moment. It wasn't a compliment and it wasn't an insult. It was an observation. "The potion cleared this morning," Harry said. "Granger's work. With your adjustment to the calcification ratio." Snape's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a fraction of acknowledgement, the kind he gave with such economy that each instance had the weight of a full sentence from anyone else. He unfolded his arms and sat down across from Harry, which was its own kind of statement. Snape sat across from very few people. He usually positioned himself above them. "I'll tell you what I observed," Snape said, without preamble, "and then you'll tell me what you want from this conversation. I have no interest in a discussion longer than necessary." "All right." Snape looked at the middle distance for a moment, assembling something, and Harry recognized the expression. It was the one Snape wore when he was doing something he considered beneath the usual architecture of his dignity and had decided to do it anyway because the alternative was worse. "I noticed the behavioral shift in your 4th year," he said. "Specifically, the pattern of your attentiveness in class. You were never what I would call a dedicated student." He said this as a simple factual observation, but you had a particular quality of alertness that was characteristic of you. Reactive. Unpredictable. In your 4th year, beginning approximately October, that quality diminished. Harry listened. "You became compliant," Snape said, and the word came out with a specific distaste, as if it was the precise wrong word for Harry Potter. "Orderly. Less argumentative. You stopped pushing at things. You stopped asking the questions you'd previously been irritating everyone with." He paused. It was, to most of the staff, an improvement. The assumption was that you were maturing. But not to you. "I have extensive experience with the behavioral signatures of various potions," Snape said, with the flatness of someone who is not going to elaborate on how they acquired that experience. "And I have been watching you with particular attention since your 1st year for reasons that are adjacent to this conversation but not central to it." He looked at Harry directly. The compliance pattern had a chemistry to it. It had the texture of amortentia exposure rather than genuine development. And the variance was telling. Every September, the pattern would sharpen, which is consistent with reintroduction after a summer gap. You noticed the September spikes. They were not subtle to someone looking for them. Snape's jaw moved slightly. "In your 5th year I became sufficiently certain to act. I brought the concern to the headmaster in November." Harry held very still. "November. That was during Umbridge." "Yes. And Dumbledore said it was insufficient evidence." Snape's expression did something complicated and very controlled. "The headmaster said that the evidence was circumstantial, that your behavioral changes were consistent with the cumulative stress of your circumstances, and that investigating the private effects of a student based on behavioral observation alone would require a degree of intrusion that he was not prepared to authorize without more concrete evidence. Harry looked at him. He didn't want to investigate. He determined not to, Snape said, precisely. Those are different things, but the result was the same. Did he know? Do you think he actually knew and was suppressing it, or did he genuinely believe his own reasoning? Snape was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that Harry had learned, over 6 years, to read as Snape actually considering something rather than performing consideration. The headmaster, Snape said finally, is a man of genuine moral complexity. He is capable of persuading himself that a convenient truth is the correct one. He has done it before. A pause. I believe he did not want to investigate because the investigation would have been disruptive. It would have required confronting the Weasley family. It would have complicated the Order's internal relationships at a time when he considered unity more important than individual correctives. He decided I was an acceptable cost, Harry said. He decided, Snape said carefully, that your discomfort was a lesser priority than the stability of his arrangements. He looked at Harry with the expressionlessness that Harry now read as something more like discomfort than indifference. I disagreed with that assessment. I know. Harry leaned back in his chair. That's why I wanted to talk to you. You want to know what I intend to say at the Board of Governors meeting this evening. I want to know what you know at the Board of Governors meeting this evening. There's a difference. Snape's chin lifted slightly, that particular angle that meant Harry had said something that landed correctly. I know the contents of the concern I raised in November 1995. I know the headmaster's response. I know, he paused, briefly, that I continued observing after my concern was dismissed, and that my observations over the subsequent year indicated not just continued administration but escalating concentration. You knew it was escalating. I suspected. Without access to the physical evidence, suspicion was the most I could confirm. And you stayed. Harry said it without accusation, genuinely curious about the answer. You watched it escalate and you stayed in the school and you continued teaching. Snape looked at him, and for a moment the layers he usually kept firmly between himself and the world, the disdain, the performance of comprehensive hostility, were insufficient to entirely cover what was underneath. I stayed in this school for reasons that extend well beyond its student welfare record, he said. And I made a calculation that I was more useful here than absent. I have made similar calculations many times. They are not comfortable calculations. Harry thought about that. He thought about what it meant to be Severus Snape, spy, double agent, a man who had spent decades making choices between inadequate options, who had learned that every position came with compromises that could not be fully justified. He didn't feel warmth for Snape, exactly. He felt something more specific, the recognition of someone who had done something right under conditions that made doing right harder than it should have been. You helped Hermione calibrate the detox potion this morning, Harry said. Her calcification ratio was 6% low. A 6% variance produces an unpredictable surge duration. I made a technical correction. Snape said this as if it were the most mundane possible statement. It had nothing to do with you specifically. Right, Harry said. They regarded each other. The Board of Governors meeting, Harry said. Dumbledore will be there. He will chair it, Snape said. As is standard. He shouldn't chair it. He has a conflict of interest. He suppressed the original investigation. Snape looked at Harry with something that was almost an expression. You intend to raise that? I intend to raise a great many things. The headmaster is, Snape began, in the tone of someone who is about to issue a caution. I'm not afraid of Dumbledore, Harry said. The statement landed in a small stone room with a solidity that surprised even Harry slightly. He'd said it plainly, without drama, and it was simply true. He'd been afraid of Dumbledore's disappointment once, afraid of the weight of that gaze, afraid of failing the expectations of the most powerful wizard alive. He didn't feel that fear right now. He felt the specific equanimity of someone who has recently learned that the person they trusted most had decided their pain was inconvenient, and who has processed that information and arrived at the other side of it. Snape said nothing for a long moment. Then, "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." Something shifted between them in the room, not warmth, exactly, not the conversion to allies that a less complicated story might have required. Something more honest than that. Two people who had always circled each other with considerable mutual hostility, finding, in a specific narrow context, that they were pointing in the same direction. "I'll give my full account at the meeting," Snape said. "Including the November concern and the headmaster's response. Including my subsequent observations." He stood, because the conversation had reached its conclusion and Snape had always had excellent instincts for the exact moment a thing was finished. "You should be aware that the ministry representative attending this evening is Amelia Bones." Harry's eyebrows went up. Amelia Bones was head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, not a junior representative, not someone sent to take notes, but the person who ran the office that would be handling the formal investigation. Her presence indicated that the ministry was treating this with a seriousness that matched the situation. "She's thorough," Harry said. Ruthlessly, Snape agreed, which in his register was a form of high praise. "She will not be managed by Dumbledore's considerable personal authority." He moved toward the door. "One more thing." "What?" "The sixth recipient in the trunk," Snape said, without turning around. "The one McGonagall described to you as a staff member." A pause. "It is not me. I want that established clearly before this evening." Harry looked at the back of Snape's head. "I didn't think it was you." "No," Snape said, and there was something in the single syllable that Harry couldn't quite read. "I know." He opened the door and left without looking back. Harry sat in the empty room for a moment. Then he stood and went to find the Board of Governors meeting. The meeting wasn't until 7, which gave the afternoon the strange elastic quality of time that is fully occupied by things that haven't happened yet. Hermione spent it in the library with a stack of legal texts on potions poisoning statutes, annotating in the margin with a precision that Harry associated with her approaching something like battle-ready. Ron spent it in Gryffindor Tower, receiving a fluke call from Molly Weasley that none of them were present for but that Neville reported, in a hushed and careful voice, had lasted 45 minutes and involved a great deal of crying. Harry spent it talking to Demelza Torres, who was 18, a Ravenclaw 7th year now, and who sat in an empty classroom for 20 minutes after Harry told her what the trunk had contained, with her hands flat on her desk and her face doing the difficult work of receiving information that rewrote the recent past. "I always felt," she started, and stopped. "Around you I always felt, nothing. Like a wall. Which I thought was just, I assumed I was intimidated." She looked at Harry, and there was something in her face that was less distress than a cold fury he recognized. "She took that from me." "Yes," Harry said. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me." She said it quickly and not unkindly. "You didn't do it." She pressed her hands together. "The ministry will want a statement." "Yes." "Good." And in the single, clean syllable of that word, Harry heard someone who was going to be absolutely fine and was going to be appropriately furious along the way. He met with the other identified recipients across the course of the afternoon, each conversation different in its specific texture but alike in the quality of what they shared, the particular disorientation of understanding that your own recent history contained episodes you couldn't trust. Each person took it differently, one went quiet, one went immediately practical, one cried with a directness that Harry found less difficult to sit with than the quiet ones. He stayed as long as each needed. He didn't rush any of them. He'd asked to be the one to tell them and he was going to do it properly. By the time he found his way to the 7th floor and the room where the Board of Governors meeting was to be held, it was 6:45 and the castle had settled into its evening register, dimmer, quieter, the particular inhabited silence of hundreds of students in their common rooms doing homework and gossiping and being 16 in the contained world of Hogwarts. McGonagall was in the corridor outside the meeting room. She was wearing her formal teaching robes, the very dark green ones she reserved for occasions that required institutional authority, and her expression was the one that had made first years afraid of her for 40 years. When she saw Harry she gave him a long, evaluating look, the way she always looked at him before important moments, as if she was checking the structural integrity of something she'd helped build. "The board has 5 governors present," she said. "Madam Bones is already inside. The headmaster is," she paused, "managing his arrival." Harry absorbed this. He knows I talked to Snape. He knows a great many things. He generally does. Her expression was complicated in a way it rarely was. McGonagall's complications usually lived below the surface. Tonight they were visible as the kind of grief that comes from watching someone you've admired for decades make a series of choices that diminish them. "Harry. Whatever is said in there tonight, I want you to know that I intend to give a full account of my own failures in this matter. Including my failure to act on Severus's concern when the headmaster dismissed it." "You don't have to, I want to be very clear," she said, with the precision of someone who has rehearsed something until the rehearsal becomes the thing itself, "that I am not doing this because it serves any strategic purpose. I am doing it because it is true and because you deserve to have it on the record." She met his eyes. "You have been failed by this institution in specific and serious ways. The least we can do is say so plainly." Harry looked at her, and the bruise he'd been aware of since this morning, that deep thing, waiting, pressed closer to the surface and then subsided. "Thank you," he said. She gave a single nod. Opened the door. The room was larger than he'd expected, long table, high ceiling, Hogwarts's institutional chandeliers burning at full strength. 5 board governors ranged along one side, none of whose faces Harry knew well but all of whose expressions indicated they were taking the evening with the seriousness it merited. Amelia Bones sat at the end of the table on the ministry side, a solid, broad-faced woman with a monocle and the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years being underestimated and had learned to move through the world accordingly. 2 Aurors stood at the room's edges. Snape was already seated. He didn't look at Harry when Harry came in. Hermione was there, which was unexpected. She was sitting in a chair against the wall with her annotated legal texts and her composed expression, and she gave Harry a brief look when he sat down that communicated, "I arranged to be here, the board agreed, don't make a thing of it." Dumbledore entered last. He came in with his characteristic unhurried dignity, robes sweeping, silver hair catching the chandelier light, and he was exactly what he always was, Harry thought. Present. Vast. Carrying the weight of himself with the ease of long practice. His eyes swept the room with the gentleness that was his signature quality, that ancient, specific warmth that had always made people feel that they were seen and understood and safe, and his gaze landed on Harry with an expression that was complex. Not guilty. Dumbledore's expressions were never guilty. Sad, rather. Aware. The expression of a man who knew what was coming and had decided, in advance, on the particular form his engagement with it would take. "Harry," he said, in the way he'd always said it, like the name was something precious. Harry met his eyes and didn't feel the pull of it. He'd always felt the pull of it, the specific gravity of Dumbledore's attention, the warmth of his regard. He felt it now as something outside himself, a force operating on the air rather than on him, and he looked back without being moved by it. Something shifted in Dumbledore's expression. Very small. Very controlled. But there. "Let's begin," Amelia Bones said, with the decisiveness of someone who had not come to Edinburgh on a Tuesday evening to watch 2 people have a moment. The meeting opened with the formal account from McGonagall, the sealing event, the securing of evidence, the preliminary identification of the trunk's contents. She gave it with the precision of a legal document, dates and times and specific actions, and she did not soften the part where she said that a concern had been raised by a staff member in November of the previous year and had been dismissed by the headmaster without investigation. She said it plainly, in the official record of the meeting, looking at the wall rather than at Dumbledore when she said it, which was its own kind of statement. One of the governors, a heavy-set woman named Marchbanks, who Harry recognized as the head of the Wizarding Examinations Authority, looked at Dumbledore when McGonagall said it. "Is that accurate?" she asked, without preamble. Dumbledore folded his hands on the table. "There was a concern raised," he said, in a measured voice. "I made a judgment at the time that the evidence did not meet the threshold required to. You'll have the opportunity to give a full account," Amelia Bones said, cutting across him with the calm authority of someone who was not intimidated by Albus Dumbledore's sentence structures. "For now we're establishing the factual record. Is it accurate that a concern was raised and not investigated?" A pause. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Thank you." Bones made a note. Snape gave his account next. He gave it in the same way he did everything, precise, direct, stripped entirely of anything that wasn't the essential fact. He described his observations over the relevant period, his November 1995 approach to the headmaster, the specific response he received, and his subsequent continued monitoring. He did not editorialize. He did not express regret or indignation. He simply described what had happened with the accuracy of someone whose particular talent was remembering things exactly as they occurred. When he was done, Bones looked at him for a moment. "You continued observing after the headmaster dismissed your concern," she said. "Yes. Why not go to the board directly?" Snape's expression remained entirely neutral. "I had reasons to believe that escalating over the headmaster's decision would compromise other aspects of my position in this school that were, at the time, of significant importance to the wider conflict." He looked directly at Bones. Those reasons were legitimate. They were also, in this specific matter, the wrong choice. "I have noted this." Bones considered him. "Your account will be corroborated by the physical evidence." "The notebook dates align with my observation timeline precisely," Snape said. "You may verify." Then it was Harry's turn. He'd been thinking about what he wanted to say since the anteroom conversation with Snape, and what he'd arrived at was this: he wasn't going to perform. He wasn't going to be strategic about it. He was going to say what was true, clearly and completely, and let the truth do the work truth does when you give it enough room. He started with the morning, the wrongness he'd felt that he'd dismissed. He described the first time he'd read the vial label and recognized the handwriting. He described the administration log, the dates, the notations, what they meant when you understood what amortentia did to someone's relationship with their own judgment. He described the September pattern and what it felt like from the inside, the specific sensation of being reintroduced to a manufactured certainty after 3 months of gradually increasing clarity that he'd never been able to identify for what it was. He described the conversation with Ginny in the classroom. He described it accurately, giving her the intelligence she had and the complexity she had, because flattening her into a simpler villain would have been inaccurate, and he was here to be accurate. And then he said, "Professor Dumbledore knew there was reasonable cause to investigate in November of last year. I've heard his explanation of why he didn't. I want to put on the record that I don't accept it." He looked down the table at Dumbledore, who was looking back at him with that expression of sad awareness. "The explanation is that investigating would have been disruptive. That maintaining stability was more important than addressing harm done to a specific student. I understand the logic. I also understand that the logic required treating me as an acceptable cost. And I don't accept being anyone's acceptable cost." The room was very quiet. Dumbledore said, into the quiet, "Harry, I'll finish," Harry said, not loudly. "The compound formula she was planning to move to, Hermione can speak to what that would have meant. I want it understood that the current situation, as serious as it is not the full extent of what was being planned. What was stopped by a fortunate malfunction in a concealment charm is considerably worse than what had already happened." He paused. "I want a full investigation. I want every recipient identified and informed. I want the chain of institutional responsibility documented, including the decision not to investigate." He looked at Bones. "All of it. Not the version that's manageable. Amelia Bones looked at him across the table with an expression that was evaluative in a way that had nothing to do with his fame or his history or the weight of his name. She was looking at him as a person describing harm done to them, and she was deciding whether the description was credible and complete. "We'll need your signed statement," she said. "I'd like it before you leave this room." "Of course." "The compound formula mentioned in the final log entry," she said to Hermione, "you've identified it?" Hermione sat forward. "It matches the research notes for what's referred to in advanced potions literature as a permanent bonding variant. It's not love potion at that stage, it's closer to a long-term alternative. It doesn't manufacture feeling, it systematically rewrites existing preference structures. It's been illegal since 1832. She set 3 pages of notes on the table. "I've documented the relevant statutes and the specific compound's characteristics. With continued administration at the planned concentration, effects would likely have become irreversible within approximately 8 to 12 weeks. The room absorbed this. One of the governors said, quietly, 8 to 12 weeks. "Yes," Hermione said. Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore. "You understand," she said, "that the question of your knowledge and your decision not to act will need to be fully addressed." Dumbledore's expression had not changed through Harry's statement, through Hermione's assessment, through Marchbanks's question. He sat with the stillness of someone who was carrying something heavy and had decided in advance how to carry it. "I understand," he said. "And I am prepared to give a full account." He paused. "I would ask the board to understand that my decision was made in what I believed were the best interests, with respect, Headmaster," Amelia Bones said, and the respect in her voice was the real kind, acknowledgement of genuine weight, not a social nicety. "The question of what you believed is secondary to the question of what was done. We'll return to your account in due course." Dumbledore nodded. Harry looked at him. He'd expected this moment to feel like something, a resolution, a settling of accounts, the specific satisfaction of a person in power being made to face what they'd avoided. What he actually felt was something quieter and less dramatic and more real. He felt, looking at Dumbledore's vast and genuinely complicated face, the loss of something that had been important to him. The loss of a certainty. Not just the certainty that Dumbledore was wise and good and navigating everything correctly, he'd been losing that certainty for a year, losing it gradually as the accumulated weight of Dumbledore's choices became visible. But the loss of the possibility of that certainty. The closing of the door on the version of the world where someone else could be trusted to manage the important things. It wasn't devastating. It was just, the end of something. The beginning of something else. He looked away from Dumbledore and found Hermione watching him from her chair against the wall with the specific attention she reserved for things she was worried about. He gave her a small nod. He was all right. She pressed her lips together and nodded back. The meeting ran for another hour and a half. Bones took statements, the governors asked questions, the institutional machinery of formal inquiry ground through its necessary procedures with the thoroughness that characterized it when the right people were running it. Harry gave his signed statement. So did Snape, with the careful specificity of long practice with legal documents. McGonagall gave hers and did not look at Dumbledore when she signed it. When it was over and the governors were gathering papers and the Aurors were resealing the evidence, Dumbledore crossed the room and stood beside Harry, and Harry waited to feel the gravity of it and felt instead only the steady ground under his own feet. "I failed you," Dumbledore said. He said it simply, without the elaborate architecture of explanation. Just the plain fact of it, set down between them. Harry looked at him. "Yes," he said. "You did." "I told myself it was complexity," Dumbledore said. "That I was managing something larger than any one person's experience. I have told myself that story before, in different circumstances, and it has sometimes been true. In this instance," he stopped. His eyes were very bright. "In this instance, it was the wrong story." "I know why you told it," Harry said. "I understand the logic. I also think you know that understanding the logic isn't the same as forgiving the choice." "No," Dumbledore said. "It isn't. You'll give your full account to Bones's investigation. I will give everything I have to it, Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like the first honest thing Harry had heard from him in some time. Not wisdom, not guidance, not the managed warmth of a man who had always been 5 steps ahead of everyone around him. Just truth. The unadorned kind that cost something. Good, Harry said. He left Dumbledore standing in the nearly empty room and walked out into the corridor where Hermione and Ron were waiting. Ron had appeared at some point during the meeting's conclusion, had been there when Harry came out, leaning against the corridor wall with his arms folded and the expression of someone who had had a very difficult afternoon and was now simply present because being present was what he could do. How was the flu call? Harry asked. Educational, Ron said, in a voice that had settled into something that would, eventually, be okay. Mum is, he exhaled. Mum is having a response that is very mum-shaped. It's going to take time. And your dad? Dad's at the ministry. He was in Bones's office when the notification came in. Ron paused. He was the one who said it needed to be fully investigated. Whatever else. He said that first. Harry thought about Arthur Weasley, who loved Muggle objects and treated everyone with a kind of genuine, unchoreographed decency. He felt, for Arthur, a real and uncomplicated warmth that he recognized as entirely his own. Right, Harry said. What do you need right now? Ron thought about it with genuine consideration. Food, he said. I still haven't eaten. And something that isn't this corridor. The kitchens, Hermione said. The kitchens, Ron agreed. They walked through the nighttime castle together, 3 of them through stone and candlelight and the specific quiet of Hogwarts after hours, and Harry felt the shape of the day behind him, vast and strange and full of difficult specific things that had happened and would continue to have consequences, and he let it be what it was. Not resolved. Not finished. Just true. The kitchens were warm and bright and a house elf named Topper provided them with sandwiches and tea without being asked, reading the room with the uncanny accuracy of someone who had been providing food to difficult situations for decades. They ate. Nobody said anything important. Ron described, in increasing detail, the particular way his mom had said the word investigation about 17 times in 45 minutes, which was either genuinely funny or had the quality of relief that made things seem funny, and Harry laughed at it, a real laugh, the specific sound of something that had been tight loosening. Hermione told them about the legal statute she'd found for the permanent bonding compound, which had been made illegal in 1832 after a case that she described with the animation of someone who found historical legal precedent genuinely compelling, which she did, which was one of many things about her that Harry valued without being able to fully explain. Ron ate 3 sandwiches and looked incrementally more like himself. The kitchen fire burned warm and steady. Tomorrow there would be more, the formal ministry investigation beginning in earnest, Ginny facing whatever came next, Dumbledore facing whatever came next, the school trying to reconfigure itself around a scandal that had broken its morning open and would take weeks to settle. Tomorrow there would be more difficult conversations and more things that needed facing and the long slow work of something that had been wrong for years being made right. Tonight there was tea and sandwiches and the specific warmth of being in the right company. Harry looked at the fire. He thought about the administration log and what it said about the last 2 years of his life. He thought about what had been taken and what had survived the taking. He thought about the specific realness of sitting in this kitchen with these 2 people who had never needed a potion to make them stay. He thought, I'm still here. He thought, that's enough for tonight. Outside, the castle held the dark around it, patient and old and full of everything that had happened today and everything that was still coming, and the real sky above it showed whatever the sky showed, cloud or star or the particular dark of a night between things, with the honesty that had always been there, whether anyone was looking or not. Chapter 5, The Potion Breaks. 3 days passed before Harry cried. He hadn't expected it to take that long, or to arrive the way it did, not in a moment of confrontation or revelation, not in the immediate aftermath of something dramatic, but on a Thursday morning in the hospital wing while Madame Pomfrey was conducting the second residual potion scan, running her wand across his forearm in slow measured passes while the diagnostic charm lit the air above him in gradients of fading amber. She was making notes. He was looking at the ceiling. And something in the ordinariness of it, the clean white ceiling, the smell of antiseptic and dittany, the faint scratch of Pomfrey's quill, the grey morning light coming through the high narrow windows, opened something that all the drama of Tuesday hadn't been able to reach. "The amber is lighter today," Pomfrey said, in her professional voice. "The compound is clearing well." Hermione's formula was precise. She made another note. "You may feel some emotional volatility over the next few days as the last residual traces clear. It's entirely normal." Harry was already crying. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind with sound and shaking. Just the quiet kind that happened when the body decided it had been carrying something long enough and was going to set it down now regardless of whether you'd chosen a convenient moment. Tears tracking down into his hairline because he was still lying flat, looking at the ceiling, and it seemed like too much effort to sit up and be composed about it. Pomfrey saw and said nothing for a moment. She set her clipboard aside. She poured a glass of water from the pitcher on the bedside table and set it where his hand could find it, and then she went back to her notes because she was a woman who understood that sometimes the most dignified thing you could offer someone was the pretense that you hadn't noticed. Harry appreciated this enormously. He looked at the ceiling and let the thing happen. It wasn't grief for Ginny, it wasn't even primarily grief. It was the specific grief of lost time, which was different and in some ways worse, because lost time didn't have a face. You couldn't argue with it or understand it or reconcile with it. 2 years. He'd been 17 in October. Which meant that from 15 to 17, during 2 of the most formative years of anyone's life and the most specifically brutal years of his, he'd been navigating everything through a manufactured fog. Every decision that had felt settled had been settled by chemistry. Every certainty had been borrowed. Every version of himself he'd been in that time was a version he now had to examine and re-authenticate, piece by piece. That was the exhausting part. Not the anger. Anger was easy, anger had direction and momentum. The exhausting part was the audit. Going back through your own recent history with a lantern and checking each room of it for what was genuine. He'd been doing it for 3 days. Some rooms were fine, his friendship with Ron and Hermione had been untouched, he was certain of that, the potion hadn't reached that deep or that fundamental. His feelings about the war, about what he was fighting for, about Voldemort and what needed to be done, those were his, he could feel the difference now, the specific unalloyed quality of convictions that had never been tampered with. His relationship with Hogwarts, his love of flying, his attachment to Dumbledore's army and what it had meant. Other rooms were harder. The room that held the memory of last year's DA meetings, when Ginny had been there every session and he'd felt proud of her and pleased to have her close, and he now understood that what felt like pride had been partly engineered approval, partly real and partly manufactured, and the two so thoroughly intertwined that separating them was like trying to untwist a braid. The room that held 5th year's Quidditch, how many of those mornings had been pre-Quidditch on a label somewhere? How many times had he flown with something in his pumpkin juice? He'd asked Hermione about this on Wednesday. Whether Amortentia could affect his flying. She'd thought about it carefully, the way she thought about things she wanted to be precise about. Not directly, she'd said. The potion acts on emotional orientation, not on skill or reflex. What you could do on a broom, you could do. But your enjoyment of it, she'd paused. Your emotional state around it might have been, colored. By being near her during those moments. The potion would have associated the good feeling of flying with her presence. He'd sat with that. Flying had always been the clearest thing in his life, the one space where everything simplified. He'd been defending the authenticity of it since Tuesday, and Hermione had just made that more complicated. Does that mean the flying wasn't real? He'd asked. No, she'd said, immediately and firmly. The flying was real. Your ability was real. The joy of it was real. The potion might have added a layer to it, but it couldn't create something that wasn't there. You loved flying before any of this started. She'd met his eyes. The potion couldn't manufacture that. It can intensify, it can redirect, it can associate. It cannot create something from nothing. He'd held on to that. He was still holding on to it now, on the white ceiling of the hospital wing, while the crying wound down to something more manageable. He sat up. Drank the water. Ran his sleeve across his face with the pragmatism of someone who was not going to spend longer than necessary in this particular moment. Pomfrey glanced over from her desk with the practiced non-expression of someone who had been managing the emotional fallout of difficult things for 30 years. The amber will be pale gold by Monday, she said. One more scan Saturday. And then, she paused, which was unusual for her. She was a woman of brisk certainties. And then you're clear. The compound residuals will be gone and what you're left with is entirely your own. Good, Harry said. I want to say something, she said, setting her quill down, which was also unusual. Pomfrey did not typically set her quill down to say things. She said things while continuing to do 3 other things simultaneously. I should have looked more carefully. Every student passes through this wing. Every student has a physical record. There are behavioral notes in those records. I should have caught the pattern. Harry looked at her. I didn't, she said, flatly and without excuse. I am adding that to the official account I'm providing to the ministry investigation. And I'm telling you directly because, she pressed her lips together. Because you came through that door 17 times in the last 2 years and I treated you and sent you back and I didn't see it. You're the 4th person to apologize to me in 3 days, Harry said. Is that too many? No, he said, honestly. It's the right number so far. I'm not counting. He looked at his hands. The diagnostic scan had left a faint warm tingle in his forearm that was already fading. Pomfrey. The other recipients who came through here. Is there any chance they presented symptoms that, I've already reviewed their records, she said. Yes. Her voice was very controlled. There are anomalies in 2 of the other cases that I should have flagged. I didn't recognize the pattern because I wasn't looking for it. I am looking for it now. She picked her quill back up. You can go to breakfast. He slid off the bed. He was halfway to the door when she spoke again. 64 times, she said. He stopped. What? You came through that door 64 times in the last 2 years. Not 17. I miscounted earlier. She didn't look up from her notes. I wanted to give you the accurate number. He stood in the doorway for a moment. 64 times in 2 years, with something in his system that wasn't his. 64 times she treated some consequence of being Harry Potter and sent him back to a life that was being quietly managed around him. Thank you, he said. For the accurate number. The corridor outside the hospital wing was empty at this hour, the early morning quiet of a castle not yet fully awake, and Harry walked through it toward the great hall and let the number settle into place beside all the other numbers he'd accumulated this week. Some numbers were just numbers. Some numbers were the shape of something you needed to know in order to know how big the thing had been. Ron was already at the Gryffindor table when Harry arrived, which meant he'd been up for a while, which was increasingly how you could tell Ron was having a hard time because Ron's default mode was sleeping as long as physically possible. He had a mug of tea in both hands and the expression of someone who had been sitting with something quiet for long enough to be at peace with it, or at least to be at peace with not being at peace. Pomfrey scan? Ron asked, when Harry sat down. Second one. Clearing well. Ron nodded. He poured Harry a cup of tea from the pot without asking, the way he'd been doing since Tuesday, which was one of the small steady things that Harry had been noting with the particular attention you give to things that turn out to be more important than they look. Ron had been making small practical gestures all week, the tea, appearing in corridors at useful moments, eating meals with deliberate normality at the Gryffindor table in full view of everyone even when clearly the last thing he felt like doing was being in public. He wasn't performing. He was just, there. Consistently and without announcement. Mum's coming Friday, Ron said. He said it to his tea. Harry waited. She's been, Ron stopped. He turned his mug between his hands. I talked to her again last night. She keeps shifting between defending Ginny and being horrified by what Ginny did, and it's like watching someone try to stand in two places at once. Which, I understand. I've been doing it too, a bit. He paused. She said something last night that was, what did she say? She said she thought you were lucky Ginny loved you so much. His voice was very level. She didn't mean it how it sounds. She was in the middle of something complicated and she was trying to. He stopped again. But that's what she said. Harry held his tea. How did you respond? I put the Fluke connection out. Ron looked up. I didn't slam it or shout. I ended it, and then I sat in the common room for a while, and then I went to bed. He met Harry's eyes. She's going to come Friday and there's going to be a version of that conversation again but in person, and he pressed his mouth together. I'm not going to agree with it. Whatever else. I'm not going to agree with it. I know, Harry said. She loves you, Ron said. My mum. Genuinely, in the real way. She's not a bad person. She just loves her daughter and she's looking for the version of this that means her daughter isn't. He stopped. Is Ginny at home? Harry asked. Since yesterday. McGonagall and the board sent her home pending the investigation outcome. She's at home. Ron looked at the table. Dad's been different. He's been clear. Which is hard in its own way, watching Dad be the clearer one. Mum usually, he shook his head. Anyway. Hermione arrived from the direction of the library, which meant she'd been up since before dawn, which also meant she had something she wanted to tell them. She sat down, poured herself tea, opened a folder she was carrying, and then apparently thought better of it and closed the folder and looked at them both. How are you both? She said. Not quite a question. Functional, Ron said. Clearing, Harry said. She looked at them each in turn with the diagnostic care she'd been applying to both of them since Tuesday, the specific attention of someone who had appointed herself the monitor of two separate but related emotional recovery processes and was taking both seriously. Then she nodded once, satisfied with the answers, and opened the folder. Amelia Bones's office sent a preliminary communication to McGonagall this morning, she said. I was in the office when it arrived. McGonagall let me see it. She set the document on the table between them, low enough that it wasn't visible to anyone else at the table. The formal charges are being filed today. 3 counts under the Potions Poisoning Act, non-consensual administration, enhanced dosing of a minor without consent, and attempted escalation to a classified compound. She paused. Plus the secondary charges for the other recipients. And Dumbledore? Harry asked. Separately. She pointed to a line near the bottom of the document. Misconduct in office. Failure to investigate a formal welfare concern. There'll be a review by the Board of Governors and a separate Wisengamot inquiry. She looked at Harry. He's been asked to step back from chairing any further board meetings related to this matter. He agreed. Ron made a small sound. Is he going to lose his position? I don't know, Hermione said honestly. The inquiry will determine that. It depends on what he says, what the board decides, how the Wisengamot weighs. She stopped. It's not certain. He has a lot of standing. He's done a lot that's genuinely important. She said this without enthusiasm, as simple fact. But something will change. I think he knows that. Harry thought about Dumbledore in the empty meeting room, the plain admission, the look on his face that had been, for the first time in Harry's experience, simply the face of a man rather than the face of a legend. He thought about what it meant to have enormous power and genuine intelligence and a capacity for self-persuasion large enough to use both of those things to protect yourself from a truth you didn't want to face. What about the permanency formula? Harry asked. The research notes for the compound variant she mentioned. Hermione's expression shifted. That's actually why I wanted to talk to you this morning. She reached into the folder and produced a separate sheet, covered in her own precise handwriting. I've been working with the potions evidence team. Bones let me consult, which was, she paused, and Harry recognized the brief bright quality of someone who had been given extraordinary access and found it both thrilling and sobering simultaneously. The research notes in the trunk indicate that she'd actually progressed further than the final log entry suggested. She hadn't just planned to research the compound formula. She'd been actively developing it. Ron sat up straighter. She'd brewed it? Not successfully. The notes show about a dozen failed attempts. The compound is extremely difficult, the interactions between the amortentia base and the long-term alteration catalyst are unstable. She hadn't cracked the stability problem. Hermione set the sheet down. But she'd been trying for approximately 4 months. Alongside the standard administration. She was working on the escalation in parallel. Harry looked at the sheet. The handwriting on the notes Hermione had transcribed was the same neat, clinical script from the administration log, and seeing it again produced a response that was different from Tuesday's, not shock, not the disorientation of revelation, but a cold, clear assessment. He'd been living alongside this for 2 years, had eaten breakfast 6 feet from the person running this project, had trusted the manufactured warmth of it and had attributed his own foggy uncertainty to his general inability to process normal human things. I want to be clear about something, he said. Both of them looked at him. I'm not going to spend the rest of the year, the rest of however long, being defined by this. I'm not going to walk through this school as the person this happened to. I'm going to be, he paused, looking for the accurate word. Myself. Which is something I can actually do now. But I'm not going to carry this as the most important thing about me. No one expects you to, Hermione said. The school is going to, a bit, Ron said, with the honesty that made him invaluable. For a while. You know how Hogwarts is. I know, Harry said. I'll navigate that. What I mean is, he looked at his tea. I spent 2 years thinking I was feeling things I wasn't feeling and not feeling things I was. And now I'm clear and it turns out what I actually feel is, he thought about it. I feel like myself. I feel like I want to do the things I've always wanted to do. I want to be good at defense against the dark arts. I want to fly. I want to be here, with you two, having this completely normal terrible morning with bad institutional tea. He looked up. All of that is real. All of that is mine. And I'm going to hold on to that more than I hold on to what was taken. Ron was looking at him with an expression that was complicated in the way real things were complicated. That's very mature, he said. I'm a bit annoyed by it, honestly. I'm still in the part where I'm furious. You're allowed to be furious, Harry said. I'm furious too. I'm just also, he shrugged. Both. Both, Ron repeated, and something in him seemed to settle fractionally. Yeah. Both. Hermione closed her folder. She picked up her tea and held it in both hands and looked at them across the table with an expression she usually kept well below the surface, the one that said she loved them, specifically and completely, in the undemonstrative way that mattered more than demonstrative things. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Harry caught it and Ron caught it and they all drank their terrible institutional tea in the early morning of a Thursday and let it be enough. The rest of the day moved with the quality of things that had been anticipated for long enough that arriving in them felt almost anticlimactic. The formal investigation team from the ministry arrived mid-morning, 3 people from Bones's office with official robes and the purposeful efficiency of people who had a specific job and intended to do it. They moved through the castle with the low-key authority of the professionally serious, conducting interviews with students and staff in the small meeting room McGonagall had designated for their use. Harry gave his third formal statement of the week, this one longer and more specific than the first two, because each interview built on the previous ones and the evidence had become more comprehensive with each day's additional analysis. He gave it in the same way he'd given the others, plainly, completely, without performance. The investigator assigned to his case was a young woman named Aldrich, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, quick with her quill and quicker with her follow-up questions. She had the specific quality of someone who had chosen her profession because she genuinely cared about what it was for, which Harry found, after a week of institutional people managing things, deeply refreshing. "One question before we finish," Aldrich said, at the end of the formal statement. She set her official quill down and picked up an ordinary one, which indicated she was going off the record. "Not for the investigation. Just, I want to ask. Are you receiving support? Personal support, not institutional." Harry looked at her. "My two best friends. Are they?" She paused. "Are they the right support for this specific thing, or do you need someone outside the situation?" It was a better question than he'd expected, from a source he hadn't anticipated. He thought about it honestly. Ron and Hermione were inside the situation, they had been since Tuesday morning, had been for 6 years before that, and there were things he couldn't say to them that he could say to no one else. But there were also things specific to this, the particular experience of having your sense of your own feelings systematically falsified, that needed a different kind of space. "There might be a healer at St. Mungo's," Aldrich said, still off the record, "who specializes in non-consensual potion cases. She's worked with several people over the years. If you wanted a name." "Yeah," Harry said, after a moment. "I'll take the name." She wrote it on a small piece of parchment and slid it across the table, and Harry folded it and put it in his pocket, and she picked up her official quill again and they wrapped up the formal statement with the briskness of returning to a professional register. Luna was waiting in the corridor when he came out. This was, on reflection, not that surprising. Luna had been a consistent peripheral presence all week, appearing in corridors at moments that could have been coincidence but never quite felt like it, not inserting herself into anything but present in the way that people who see things others miss are often present, calmly, without drama, in the right place at the right time. She was carrying something, a small jar with what appeared to be a greenish substance, and a book tucked under her arm with a cover that said The Healing Properties of Absurdity in cheerful yellow letters. "Harry," she said, falling into step beside him with the naturalness of someone who had never felt the need to ask permission for things that were clearly fine. "Luna. You look better today than you did on Tuesday," she said. "Your eyes are different." "Clearer," he said. "Yes. Like someone opened a window." She considered this. "I've been thinking about you since Tuesday. I didn't say anything before now because you had a great many people saying things and I thought more was probably not useful. That was perceptive of you. I'm often perceptive. People find it surprising." She didn't say this with any bitterness. Luna's observations about how people received her were always stated as simple facts, as empirical as observations about weather. "I wanted to say something now because I think you might be in the part where the big events have passed and the actual weight of it is arriving, and that's sometimes the loneliest part." Harry looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate. I had something like that happen to me," she said, in the same conversational tone she used for everything. Not the same thing. But something that took something from me that I couldn't get back exactly as it was. I had to get it back differently." She offered him the jar. "This is dirigible plum preserve. My father makes it. It's very good for days when the ground doesn't feel entirely reliable." He took the jar. It was small and warm and the lid had a hand-drawn label with a tiny plum on it in Luna Lovegood's unmistakable style. "Thank you," he said, and meant it without reservation. "The other thing I wanted to say," she continued, as they reached a junction in the corridor where their paths presumably diverged, "is that the real version of you, the one that's there now, the clear one, has always been here. I've always been able to see it. You've always been yourself underneath everything." She paused. Some people are hard to see clearly. You've always been easy to see. I just thought you should know that someone could see you. Harry stood in the corridor junction and looked at Luna Lovegood, who had a jar of dirigible plum preserve named after impossible things and a book about absurdity and the particular gift of saying the true thing at the moment you most needed to hear it. "Luna," he said. "Thank you." She smiled, the real smile, not the dreamy one she deployed for the general public, but the one underneath it that was sharp and warm and entirely itself. "You're welcome," she said, and walked off down her corridor with the specific unhurried certainty of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Harry stood in the junction for a moment with a jar of dirigible plum preserve in his hands. Then he laughed. A real laugh, short and sudden, the kind that surprised him. He laughed and then he stood in the quiet corridor and breathed, and the breathing was good and the silence was good and the jar in his hands was warm and specific and real. He went to the Quidditch pitch. Not to fly, not yet, he'd fly tomorrow, he'd planned to fly on the weekend when the last scan was done and the residuals were fully gone, he wanted to fly clean. Just to stand in it. The pitch was empty in the mid-afternoon, the stands surrounding it in their cold wooden dignity, the late autumn light hitting the grass at the low angle that made everything look as though it was made of something more permanent than light. He stood in the center of it and looked up at the open sky above the pitch and felt the scale of it, the honest expanse of it, the complete indifference of it to everything happening in the castle behind him. He stood there for a long time. He thought about what Pomfrey had said, what you're left with is entirely your own. He tested it. He looked up at the sky and thought about flying, about the specific bodily joy of it, and looked for the amortentia taint in the feeling, the association it might have built between flying and her presence, and found, sky. Just sky. The physical memory of speed and height and the total aliveness of his body at altitude. It was clean. It was entirely, unambiguously his. He felt the relief of that move through him like something structural settling. "You've been out here for 20 minutes. Ron had appeared at the edge of the pitch, hands in his robe pockets, Hermione beside him. They'd come together because of course they had, because the three of them had the collective instinct of people who'd been in enough difficult things together that they'd developed a shared weather sense for when someone needed finding. "I know," Harry said. They walked out to where he was standing. The three of them stood in the center of the pitch looking up. "I want to say something," Harry said, without looking away from the sky. He waited, gathering it. "I don't know exactly what I want," he said. "I don't know what I'd have felt without the potion. Maybe I'd have had feelings for her anyway. Maybe I'd have had feelings for someone else entirely. Maybe I'd have been completely oblivious to everyone for years, which is honestly the most likely option." Ron made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. "But whatever it would have been, it was mine to have. The choosing of it was mine. And that was taken, and he paused. "I'm angry about it. And I'm sad about it. And I'm also," he looked at the sky. "I'm also here. Standing in this pitch with you two and a jar of dirigible plum preserve that Luna gave me, which I'm genuinely pleased to have. And that's real. That's all completely, verifiably real. And I'm going to choose to live here, in the real things, because the alternative is living in the audit of what was taken, and that's," he stopped. "That's not living." Hermione put her arm through his. She didn't say anything. She just put her arm through his and looked up at the same sky. Ron put his hand on Harry's other shoulder, briefly and solidly, the way he'd been doing all week. Then he said, because he was Ron and he was incapable of letting a serious moment go completely without puncture, "What exactly is a dirigible plum, though?" "No one knows," Harry said. "Luna knows," Hermione said. "Luna knows," Harry agreed. "But she's not telling." They stood in the center of the pitch in the failing afternoon light, the real sky above them in all its honest grey gold, and the castle behind them full of everything that was still unresolved and ongoing and large, and it was all there, the weight of it, the truth of it, the ongoing specific difficulty of it, and Harry stood in the middle of it and felt, underneath everything else, the solid particular fact of himself. Which was, he thought, exactly what had been missing for 2 years. Which was, he thought, enough to build everything else from. The sky held no rose-gold light. No labels, no dates, no concentrations. Just the dark coming in over the hills, honest and ordinary and indifferent, the way the sky always was and the way Harry was only now, finally, learning to be grateful for. He opened the jar of dirigible plum preserve on the walk back, because it was cold and he was hungry, and it tasted improbable and sweet, and he decided it was his new favorite thing, and this decision was entirely, verifiably, completely his own. Chapter 6, A Sky That Belongs to No One. The Wizengamot hearing was set for the second Saturday of November. Harry knew this because Amelia Bones told him directly, in the same crisp manner she'd applied to everything since Tuesday, no softening, no managing of expectations, just the facts arranged in order of importance. The hearing would address the formal charges against Ginny Weasley under the Potions Poisoning Act. Given that Ginny was 16, the proceedings would be conducted under juvenile protocols, which meant a smaller chamber, a restricted gallery, different sentencing parameters. But the charges themselves were adult charges, because the Potions Poisoning Act did not have a junior category. What had been done was what had been done regardless of who had done it. Harry had 2 weeks, then. 2 weeks in which the castle had to reconfigure itself around something that had broken its Tuesday open and was still settling, the way structures settle after something large moves through them, not destroyed, not the same, finding new equilibrium. It was strange, those 2 weeks. Not bad strange, mostly. Just the particular strangeness of a life that had been running at one temperature for 2 years, cooling back to its actual ambient and having to relearn what the actual ambient felt like. He went back to classes. He sat in defense against the dark arts and was sharper than he'd been in months, his mind running faster, making connections he'd been half making for a year and fully completing them now. Flitwick mentioned, with mild surprise, that his charms work had improved noticeably. Harry thought about this and decided it made sense. When the part of your brain that monitored and dismissed the wrongness sensation was no longer required, apparently quite a lot of cognitive resource became available for other things. He flew on the Saturday after the last Pomfrey scan, the morning after the clear diagnostic, the pale gold reading that meant entirely your own. He took his firebolt to the empty pitch at 7 in the morning before anyone else was up, and he climbed to 300 feet and hung there for a full minute just breathing, and then he dove, and the feeling of it was so clean and specific and verifiably his that he shouted once at the empty sky and the empty pitch and the morning, loud and without self-consciousness, the specific uncontained joy of something returned. He saw the healer at St. Mungo's whose name Aldrich had given him. Her name was Calloway. She was 50, she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the particular quality of people who were very good at a specific thing, a kind of settled presence, unhurried and exact. The first session was mostly her listening and him talking, finding the edges of things by saying them out loud. She didn't tell him how to feel about any of it. She asked questions that were the right questions, which meant they were sometimes uncomfortable and always useful. He went back the following week. He thought he would keep going. The week before the hearing, Molly Weasley came to Hogwarts. Harry knew she was coming, Ron had told him, with the careful neutrality he'd developed for conversations about his family over the past 2 weeks. She'd requested a meeting with Harry through McGonagall's office, which was formal enough to indicate she understood she wasn't in a position to simply show up and expect warmth. Harry agreed to the meeting because refusing it seemed more complicated than having it, and because he understood that whatever needed to happen with the Weasley family needed to happen, and avoiding it was only deferring the weight of it. McGonagall offered her office. Harry said the courtyard would be better, outside, open, nothing institutional about it. McGonagall agreed without pressing for reasons, which Harry appreciated. The November courtyard was cold, the sky the thick flat white of winter approaching, the stone benches dusted with frost that hadn't entirely cleared by 11 in the morning. Harry was there first. He sat on a bench and watched a pair of third years hurry past at the courtyard's far end, too wrapped up in their own drama to register him, and thought about nothing in particular with the deliberateness he'd been practicing. Molly Weasley came through the archway, and she looked smaller than Harry had ever seen her. Not physically smaller, she was still the same person, the same warm architecture of her, the same quality of presence that had always felt like being enveloped in something generous. But something in her posture had compressed, the way confident people compress when they've been carrying shame long enough that the weight has changed their shape. She sat across from him on the opposite bench, not beside him. Harry noticed this. It was correct, she was giving him space rather than proximity, and he appreciated the accuracy of the instinct even if it hadn't come naturally to her. "Harry," she said. "Molly." He'd called her that for 3 years. It still fit. He wasn't going to give that up. She looked at him for a moment, and her eyes were red around the edges in the way of someone who had been crying at intervals for 2 weeks and was not going to do it right now. "I need to say something and I need you to let me say it without interruption," she said. "And then I need you to tell me honestly how you receive it. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. She took a breath. "I said something to Ron 2 weeks ago that was wrong. I said it because I was trying to find a way to make what my daughter did into something that could be contained in a smaller box than it belongs in. I was looking for the version of it where you were all right and Ginny was just someone who loved too much, and I used that framing out loud to Ron and it was wrong and I knew it was wrong when he ended the flu call." She stopped. Her jaw was very tight. "I have spent 2 weeks fighting with myself about my daughter, which is the hardest thing I've done in a very long time, and I am not here to tell you that it's finished or that I've arrived somewhere settled about it. I haven't. She is my daughter and I love her in a way that I cannot qualify or condition. That will always be true." She met his eyes. "And what she did to you was a serious wrong. Not a mistake, not an excess of feeling, a serious, sustained, calculated wrong. And I am telling you that I know that, and that I am sorry that it happened in a family that calls itself yours." Her voice had gone very steady and very quiet. "You have called this home for 6 years. Arthur and I have meant that sincerely. Whatever happens with Ginny, whatever the hearing determines, you are still ours. If you want to be." Harry looked at her across the frost-dusted courtyard. He thought about every Christmas at the Burrow. Every meal at that table. The specific quality of being in a house that was full and warm and slightly chaotic in the way of a place where people actually lived, rather than the ordered chill of the Dursleys or the grandeur of Hogwarts, which was magnificent but was never quite the same as a home someone had built around ordinary love. He thought about Arthur Weasley saying, clearly and first, that it needed to be fully investigated. He thought about Ron, every morning for 2 weeks, pouring tea without being asked. "I know," he said. "I know you mean it." He paused. I don't have a verdict on your family, Molly. I'm not sitting here deciding whether you're in or out of my life. That's not how I work and you're not responsible for what Ginny did. Arthur isn't. Ron certainly isn't. He looked at his hands for a moment. What I need, and I'm telling you this because you asked me to be honest, what I need is for the people around me to hold this accurately. Not to minimize it or manage it into something smaller than it was. Just to know what it was and call it by its right name." Molly's throat moved. "A serious wrong," she said. "Yes. I can do that," she said. "I will do that." "Then we're all right," Harry said. "You and me. We're all right." She pressed her lips together very hard for a moment, and Harry looked at the flat white sky above the courtyard rather than at her face, giving her the same courtesy Pomfrey had given him in the hospital wing, the pretense of not noticing, which was its own form of respect. After a moment she said, in a voice that was steady again, "Ron told me you're seeing a healer at St. Mungo's." "Yes." "Good," she said. "That's good." She stood, brushing frost from her robe with the brisk efficiency that was her natural register when she was managing something by doing rather than feeling. "I'm going to see Minerva before I go. And then I'm going home." She paused. "Ginny is," she stopped. "She's having a difficult time." Harry thought about what to say. He settled on the most honest thing. "I hope she has people around her who tell her the truth," he said. "I hope she has someone who tells her what it actually was rather than the smaller version. Not because I want her to suffer. Because she won't, she can't, change course from a false map." Molly looked at him. Something in her face did something complicated and then resolved. "Arthur says things like that," she said. "Clear things. He's a good person," Harry said. "He is." She wrapped her coat more firmly. "I'll let you know how the hearing goes." "In case, I'll be there," Harry said. "I've been asked to give testimony." She nodded. And then, because she was Molly Weasley and couldn't entirely help it even in the most careful of circumstances, she crossed the courtyard and put her arms around him for exactly 3 seconds, brief, firm, real, and then released him and walked back through the archway without looking back, her footsteps quick on the frost. Harry sat in the cold courtyard and watched her go. The flat white sky held steady above him, indifferent and honest. He thought, "I am going to be all right." Not as a reassurance but as an observation. As something he was simply noticing, the way you notice the temperature or the quality of light. He was going to be all right. Not the same as before, because before was gone and had never entirely been what he thought it was anyway. But all right in the way that mattered, clear, present, himself, in possession of the things that were his and at peace with the audit of the rest. He sat in the courtyard until he was too cold to sit anymore, and then he went back inside to find his friends. The Saturday of the hearing arrived with the same honest indifference that November had shown all month, cold, pale, unhurried, the sky above London the flat grey of a city in winter. Harry arrived at the ministry with Hermione on one side and Ron on the other, all three of them in their everyday clothes rather than school robes, because this was not school and the distinction felt important. The Wizengamot chamber for juvenile proceedings was smaller than the main chamber. Harry had been in the main chamber before, with its tiered stone seats and its atmosphere of accumulated judgment, and this one was the same in structure but reduced in scale, which made the stone feel heavier rather than lighter. 40 seats in tiered rows, most of them occupied by Wizengamot members in their plum robes. Amelia Bones at the presiding table, with the particular quality she'd had every time Harry had seen her this month of someone who had decided in advance exactly how thoroughly she was going to do her job and was doing it to that standard and not one jot below. Ginny was already there when Harry arrived. She was seated at the respondents' table with a ministry-appointed legal representative on one side of her, a careful-looking man in his 40s whose expression indicated he'd assessed the situation comprehensively and was prepared for a difficult afternoon, and Arthur Weasley on the other. Arthur looked like a man who had been sitting in extremely uncomfortable places for 2 weeks already and had developed the posture of someone who intended to see this through regardless of the cost to his own comfort. Ginny looked up when Harry came in. He hadn't seen her since the classroom on Tuesday morning 2 weeks ago, since she'd walked out without looking back. She looked, different from how he'd expected, and then, when he thought about it, exactly as he should have expected. She looked contained. Not the warm, easy containment of her usual social presentation but something more stripped down, the expression of someone who had had 2 weeks in a house with their parents and their own thoughts and the full weight of what was coming, and had arrived at some kind of reckoning with it that was visible in her face as a tiredness and a realness that her performance had never quite had. She looked at Harry without the wounded softness and without the calculated appeal and without the strategic warmth. She just looked at him, for a moment, as whatever she actually was. He didn't feel the manufactured certainty. He didn't feel the warmth that wasn't his. What he felt was the cool, complicated, appropriate response to looking at someone who had done something serious, not hatred, because he didn't have the energy for that and didn't want it anyway, but a clear and unromanticized assessment. A person he had known. A person who had made choices. A person who was now going to face the institutional consequence of those choices, and after that would have to face the harder thing, which was living with them. He took his seat in the witness gallery. The hearing ran for 4 hours. Amelia Bones ran it with the same ruthless thoroughness that had characterized her involvement from the start. The evidence was presented in full, the vials, the notebook, the administration log, the research notes for the compound formula, the independent potions analysis corroborating the notebook's accuracy. Hermione gave her technical account with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it until every word was exactly right, and the Wisengamot members who were following the chemistry were visibly sobered by it. Harry gave his testimony. He gave it the same way he'd given everything this month, plainly, completely, without performance. He described the effects of the potion on his sense of his own judgment. He described the September pattern. He described reading the administration log for the first time and what the specific language of it communicated about intent. He described the compound formula research and what irreversible meant. He spoke for 40 minutes and answered questions for another 20, and he did not look at Ginny during any of it, not because he was afraid to but because it wasn't about her. It was about the truth, set out in the record, belonging there permanently. Snape gave testimony. He gave it with the precision of a scalpel, the November concern laid out in exact detail, the headmaster's response documented accurately, his subsequent observations described with the specificity of someone whose memory for precise sequences of events was essentially perfect. He did not editorialize. He did not look at anyone in particular. He simply put the facts in order and let them stand. McGonagall gave testimony. She gave it the way she had at the board meeting, including herself in the account of failures, stating directly that she had known of the concern and deferred rather than acting independently, accepting that this had been the wrong choice. The Wisengamot member who asked her follow-up questions treated her with a courtesy that indicated they respected the quality of the self-accounting even as they formally noted the failure. Dumbledore was not present. He had submitted written testimony, which Bones read into the record with neutral completeness. His written account was, Harry had read it in advance, Bones had allowed him to, the most honest thing Dumbledore had ever put on paper in Harry's experience. It acknowledged the decision, named the reasoning, and then named the reasoning as wrong with a directness that had surprised him. Whether it was the approach of a man who had genuinely arrived at the full weight of his error, or the strategic presentation of a man who understood that full honesty was his best remaining position, Harry couldn't entirely determine. Perhaps both were true. That seemed consistent with Dumbledore. The Board of Governors' inquiry had concluded the previous week. Dumbledore remained headmaster, but under formal censure and with an appointed board oversight committee that would monitor institutional welfare processes for the next 2 years. It wasn't the removal from position that some people thought the situation warranted. It was the compromise of institutions trying to balance accountability against the weight of someone's accumulated value to the thing they'd failed. Harry had no particular feelings about this. He'd decided not to have particular feelings about it, which was its own kind of decision. Ginny's legal representative gave a considered account of mitigating factors, age, emotional history, the Chamber of Souls' possession in first year and its documented psychological sequelae, the absence of anyone in her early development identifying warning signs that might have led to intervention. Harry listened to this portion of the hearing with the particular attention of someone who is trying to be fair to a complicated situation. Some of it was accurate. The Chamber of Secrets had been real and traumatic, and its effects on Ginny had been real and documented. The question was not whether those things had happened but whether they constituted an explanation rather than a mitigating context, and whether the distinction mattered. He decided the distinction mattered. But he also decided it didn't change what he wanted from the hearing's outcome, which was the formal record, the formal acknowledgement, and the formal consequence. He didn't want punishment in the punitive sense, he wasn't there for that. He wanted the structure that said, this happened, it was wrong, it has been named correctly, and the naming stands. That was what the record was for. The Wisengamot deliberated for 90 minutes. Harry waited in the gallery with Ron and Hermione and Luna, who had appeared at the ministry that morning with the unsurprising inevitability of Luna appearing at things that mattered, wearing a set of radish earrings and carrying a copy of the Quibbler that she appeared to be reading upside down but probably wasn't. She'd sat beside Harry in the gallery for the duration, quiet and entirely present, radiating the specific comfort of someone who understood what a difficult thing felt like and was not going to minimize it or rush it. The gallery had a window. Not a real window, they were deep in the ministry building, below the level of the street, but an enchanted one, showing a facsimile of a sky outside. Harry had been to the ministry several times and had always taken the enchanted windows at face value, accepted the simulated sky without much thought. He looked at this one now and found it insufficient. Too even, too consistent. The real sky was never that steady, never that identical from one moment to the next. It always had movement, always had variation, always had weather happening somewhere. He looked at the simulated sky and thought about the ceiling of the Great Hall on a Tuesday morning 14 days ago, and the rose-gold light of 1,400 vials suspended above 4 tables, and how it had looked almost beautiful for a moment before he understood what it was. He thought about what the ceiling looked like now. He'd been watching it, these past 2 weeks, with the specific attention of someone who had learned that what was shown above you mattered. It had looked like the real sky. Every morning since Tuesday it had looked like exactly the real sky, whatever the real sky was doing, gray or clear or clouded or cold. The honest mirror. The one that had always told the truth. The Wizengamot returned. Guilty on all 3 primary charges under the Potions Poisoning Act. Guilty on 4 secondary charges relating to the other recipients. The sentencing was careful and specific: mandatory supervised rehabilitation program, 3 years, formal reparation payments to all identified recipients, a lifetime prohibition on holding any potions ingredients or equipment without ministry supervision, 2 years of intensive psychological intervention under healer-led oversight, and a formal public record of the convictions, sealed under juvenile protocols until Ginny turned 18 but unsealed and permanent thereafter. No custodial sentence. The mitigating factors had been weighed and had counted. Harry had known this was the likely outcome and had decided, in advance, that it was acceptable. He was not going to use his energy disagreeing with institutional outcomes that were within the range of appropriate. He was going to use his energy on his own life. What mattered was the record. The formal, permanent, uneditable record. When the Wizengamot chair read out the convictions and the sentencing, Harry was watching Ginny. She sat very still through the reading, the way she'd sat through most of the hearing, contained, present, that stripped-down quality of someone who had done their most serious thinking about something. When the sentencing concluded she closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them she looked, for the first time in Harry's memory of her face, genuinely young. Not the calculated youth she deployed, not the pretty vulnerability, just 16, in a stone chamber, with a record and a consequence and a future that was going to be different from the one she'd planned. She looked across the chamber and found Harry's eyes. He held her gaze. He wasn't angry, in this moment. He wasn't warm. He was simply, there. Present, himself, looking at her without fog or manufacture, and what he communicated across the chamber was the one thing he'd decided he wanted to communicate: I know what was real and what wasn't. I know who I am. And I'm going to be fine. She looked away first. Again. The chamber began to clear. Outside the ministry the November afternoon had arrived in a great arc way of short days, the streetlights already on, the city moving around the ministry entrance with complete indifference to everything that had happened below it. Harry stood on the pavement with Ron and Hermione and Luna and breathed the cold city air and let the day settle around him. Ron was quiet in a way that had substance to it, the quiet of someone arriving at the end of a particular long effort. He looked at the sky above the street, real sky, real dark, real London, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to be all right eventually. I think. If she does the work." "Maybe," Hermione said. "I hope so," Harry said. He meant it. "I think the rehabilitation will be good for her," Luna said, with the specific confidence she applied to observations that most people would have been more tentative about. "She's very intelligent. Intelligent people who do wrong things can be the most transformative when they genuinely understand what they've done." She paused. "Or the most dangerous. But I think she's the first kind." "I don't know which she is," Harry said honestly. "No," Luna agreed. "But you don't have to." Harry looked at her. "That's not your work," Luna said. What she does with the consequence is hers. You just have to do yours. Ron made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. Luna, he said, you are consistently one of the most correct people I've ever met, and it's always mildly alarming. Thank you, Luna said, as if this were a standard compliment. They stood on the pavement in the cold dark, and then, because they were 16 and 17 and had been in a stone chamber for 4 hours and it was 5:30, they collectively decided without discussing it that they were going to get food. Not at the Leaky Cauldron, not anywhere that carried the particular weight of being a known Harry Potter location. They walked 3 streets into Muggle London and found a small Italian place with steamed-up windows and a handwritten menu on a chalkboard, and they sat at a table in the back and ordered pasta and bread and something warm to drink, and the waiter who took their order had absolutely no idea who any of them were. Harry found this deeply restorative. The food arrived. The bread was good. Ron ate 2 helpings of everything with the committed focus of someone who had skipped lunch and was rectifying this at pace. Hermione ate 1 helping of everything and spent 20 minutes annotating something in the small notebook she always had on her, which was either notes for an essay or the beginning of a legal complaint against some wizard authority, both of which were equally likely. Luna ate her pasta methodically and read her Quibbler, occasionally reading passages aloud to no one in particular, which was something Harry had decided a long time ago was one of his favorite qualities in another person. Harry ate and watched his friends and felt the specific uncomplicated pleasure of being in the right place. At some point, between the bread and the dessert menu that none of them looked at, because they were going to order dessert regardless and consulting the menu was just theater, Ron said, quietly and without looking up from his plate, I told Ginny something before she left the castle. Before the hearing. Harry looked at him. I told her that I love her and I'm her brother and I'm not going anywhere, Ron said. And I told her that what she did was wrong and that it had a name and she had to face it under that name and not a smaller one. He paused. She cried. The real kind. He was quiet for a moment. I think it was the first time she heard it from someone who loves her and wasn't going to retract it or soften it. Which is, he pressed his lips together. Which is what you said Molly needs to do. Which I think Mom is starting to understand. Your dad, Harry started. Dad said it to her first, Ron said. Day 1. Apparently. Mom told me. She said Dad sat down with Ginny on the night she came home and he said it plainly and completely and then he made her dinner. Ron said this last part with a particular note in his voice that Harry read as the specific love people have for their parents when their parents do the right thing at cost to themselves. Yeah. That's my dad. Harry nodded. I want to say something, Hermione said, setting her notebook aside. She looked at them both with the expression she got before the important things, the one where she was selecting words with the care she reserved for things that needed to be exactly right. The last 2 weeks I've been thinking about something. About what it means to have been as close to this as I was, as we both were, and not seen it. She paused. I was with you every day, Harry. I knew you better than almost anyone. And I missed it. Hermione, he started. Let me finish. Her voice was gentle and precise simultaneously. I've been thinking about what it means to miss something that close. And what I've arrived at is, I think she was very careful about what she let me see. I think she specifically managed her behavior around me because she knew I was the most likely to notice. That's not an excuse, it's just, she paused. I want to be clear that I'm not going to stop watching. I'm not going to be a person who stops looking at the people around me carefully. But I also, she met Harry's eyes. I want you to know that the version of you I was always responding to, even when I couldn't see the thing happening to you, that was you. I was always responding to you. The clear version. It was always visible. Harry looked at her. He thought about what Luna had said in the corridor, you've always been easy to see. I know, he said. I know you were. Luna set her quibbler down. She looked at the 3 of them with the particular benevolent attention of someone who had been watching something resolve into its correct shape. I think we should order dessert, she said. Yes, Ron said, immediately and with conviction. They ordered dessert. It was tiramisu. It was very good. Harry ate all of his and then ate the portion of Ron's that Ron claimed not to want and then definitely wanted and attempted to reclaim, which led to a brief and undignified negotiation that ended with Ron surrendering in exchange for Harry's opinion on a Chudley Cannon's roster move that Ron had been thinking about since September. They walked back toward the Leaky Cauldron through the cold Muggle Street in the dark, and London moved around them with its enormous, indifferent, living energy, millions of people in millions of lives, the vast ordinary complexity of a world that was almost entirely unaware of wizards and Wizengamot hearings and charmed trunks and rose-gold light above 4 school tables. It was, Harry thought, one of the things he'd always loved about Muggle London, the scale of it, the way it made everything specific and personal feel appropriately sized. The way it reminded you that your story, however large it felt from the inside, was one story among incalculable others. Luna stopped at the corner and said she was going north to meet her father, who apparently had some news about a sighting of something Harry didn't catch the name of that lived in reservoirs. She hugged him briefly and firmly, the way she'd done in the courtyard, and then looked at him with that clear sharp gaze. Harry, she said. What do you want? Now that you know what you actually want. It was, he thought, the right question. The one nobody else had asked, because everyone else had been so carefully not asking anything too specific for the past 2 weeks, giving him room, which he'd needed and appreciated and was now, possibly, ready to move past. He thought about what he actually wanted. He wanted to be a good Auror someday, he thought. He'd been thinking about this more clearly than he had in months, the specific competence it required and whether he had what it took and how he'd find out. He wanted to continue seeing Calloway. He wanted to get better at potions, actually properly better, because he'd realized that his resistance to the subject had been entangled with the subject's role in what had been done to him, and untangling those two things was going to require some active effort. He wanted to play Quidditch this weekend in the cold November air, and he wanted to be good at it and feel the sky on his face and know that the joy of it was completely and verifiably his. He wanted, eventually, when he was ready and when the time was right and without any agenda attached to it, to find out what it felt like to have genuine feelings for someone without already knowing the answer, without a manufactured certainty. To have the experience of not knowing, of uncertainty, of the messy authentic process of actually falling for someone rather than being directed toward it by chemistry. He thought that would be interesting. He thought he might be good at it. He thought it would be nothing like what he'd had and that this was entirely fine. A lot of things, he told Luna. I want a lot of things. She smiled, the real one. Good, she said. That's exactly right. And she turned and walked off down the street into the London dark, her blonde hair visible for a moment before the crowd absorbed her. Harry turned back to Ron and Hermione, who were watching him with the expressions of people who had heard the exchange and were quietly, genuinely glad. They walked back to the Leaky Cauldron and through the wall and into Diagon Alley and eventually through the Floo back to Hogwarts, and the castle received them the way it always received people coming home, warmly, without fanfare, with the deep stone quiet of a building that had been holding people's lives for a very long time and was entirely prepared to hold more. Harry walked through the entrance hall and down the corridor toward the Great Hall, not because he needed anything from it but because he wanted to see the ceiling. It was evening. The hall was empty, the tables cleared, the candles burning at their nighttime lower setting. He stood in the doorway and looked up. The ceiling showed what was above it. Clear, tonight. A hard November sky with stars beginning in the east, the early stars that come before full dark, faint and specific. He could see the edge of a cloud moving from the northwest, real weather happening in real time, the enchantment doing what it had always done, showing exactly what was there, nothing more, nothing invented, nothing managed or calibrated or intended to produce a particular response. He stood in the doorway of the empty Great Hall and looked at the honest sky above it. He thought about Tuesday morning, the wrongness that had no name. He thought about the rose-gold light of 1,400 vials suspended in that same space, the cascade of them, the labels, the handwriting he recognized. He thought about a leather notebook and a brass clasp and the words for when he's ready to love me properly, and the specific cold clarity of understanding what those words meant. He thought about the morning after, and Hermione's formula and the way the manufactured thing had crested and broken and what had been under it. He thought about Ron pouring tea. He thought about the courtyard and the frost and Molly Weasley's 3-second embrace. He thought about a jar of dirigible plum preserve and the center of a Quidditch pitch at 300 feet. He thought about tiramisu and Ron disputing ownership of it and Luna walking away into London. He thought, 2 years. The exact shape of the loss, specific and complete. He thought, here. Now. This. The stars were coming in from the east, real and cold and completely indifferent, the honest light of things that were exactly as far away as they appeared. He looked up at them and felt, moving through him from somewhere below thought and language and every complicated thing that had happened this month, the simple solid fact of himself. Present. Clear. His own. He stood there for a long time, just looking. Then he turned and walked back through the castle to find his friends, and the ceiling stayed honest above the empty hall, and the stars kept coming, and the sky above Hogwarts belonged to no one and was therefore available to everyone who looked up at it with their own unmanufactured eyes, which was, Harry thought, exactly as it should be. Exactly as it should be.